Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
In this day and age, who has time for yet another origin story? Regardless of the how, the when, and the what next of Earth's first and last true superhero could be regarded as the most substantial event in human history since the first amino acids began to replicate with genetic patterns in the primordial soup that splashed around, leading to the evolution of life on ancient Terra. As with all things new, being a practically omnipotent being with a seemingly endless list of new abilities to discover and explore, Anderson found that there came a learning curve to just about all of them. His first time flying was something of a mess, as everything from takeoff to control of where he was going and how fast was a matter of trial and error in the most sincere way. First launching upwards a dozen or so feet into the air and then crashing back to Earth at 3 times the speed of terminal velocity, Anderson then decided it would be more effective simply to throw himself as high up as he could, figuring that he'd have more altitude to experiment with. This likewise resulted in disaster, as in his haste he overshot his goal and wound up in orbit, crashing into a Chinese satellite, which in turn caused a cascade effect as its broken bits in turn hurtled out in all directions, damaging, destroying, or knocking countless other satellites out of their own orbits. Billions of dollars in damage were the result, alongside countless navigation, communication, and spy satellites suddenly going dark without explanation. It would take years to repair the damage to the various networks and services they provided, and upon realizing what he had done whilst floating in open space, Anderson decided to slip back down to Earth as quietly and unnoticed as possible. His next attempt at flight, while more controlled and with a bit more developed skill than the last, was likewise something of a disaster, as just as he found himself managing to cruise at a reasonable altitude and reasonable speed, he was lacking the proper instrumentation or sensors to pick up on the FedEx cargo jet, which seemed to materialize out of nowhere as it smashed into him in the midst of a dense gray cloud. While he was unharmed, the jet did not fare so well, as his indestructible body tore through the wing and fuselage like a hot knife through warm butter. While quite the calamity, it did provide Anderson his first true superhero moment, as gripping tightly onto the exposed frame, he managed to catch the aircraft before it hit the ground, lowering it as slowly and gently as he could. While successful in this, the crew inside sadly all perished as the sudden shift in inertia proved too much for their fragile human bodies. Looking inside after landing, he had hoped to be greeted with thanks and acclaim, but sadly, all that he found was a mess of viscera and detached limbs, with several torsos still safely buckled into the seats that, for the most part, were as strewn about the plane as the blood and guts which came from them. Anderson struggled not to vomit, but was unsuccessful, retching all over, contributing both to the foul sight and atrocious smell. He lingered for a few moments outside of the bloodied wreckage, vomiting and breathing deeply, waiting for the sickness to pass. The snot and tears from his face, he looked around to notice he was standing in a rather barren field. However, with his enhanced hearing, he could hear emergency services approaching from far off. Realizing first that trying to explain what had happened could severely compromise him, and then that he was clearly no longer in the US, as the whining sirens sounded nothing like American standards, he decided it would be best to take off before any questions, regardless of the language, could be asked. As he rocketed into the sky, a deep sense of guilt and remorse overtook him. He couldn't help but think about how the people that mess of entrails and blood used to be could have had families, dreams, ambitions. One may have been ready to retire, Another may have been looking forward to a child's graduation or vacation with loved ones. There was no way to know for sure. Then, however, he realized there was a way to tell when news reports and obituaries came out, and decided in that moment that for the sake of his own mental health, it was probably wisest to avoid them. He likewise realized that if he was to master his new abilities, it would be best to do so away from prying eyes and potential collateral damages. It was not until smashing through that plane that he was even aware he was effectively indestructible, and upon learning such, began to wonder what else he could do. Flying high above the earth, it was in a grand expanse of forest that he decided to experiment, landing in a less than gentle fashion, which, in addition to falling flat on his ass upon touchdown, created a small crater in the ground and a slight shockwave throughout the forest, which sent the nearby birds and wildlife scrambling for safety. He rose and looked about, gauging what his surroundings had to offer. There was a large boulder sat between two tall trees just to his right. Time, he thought, to test out his strength. Strolling over to the massive rock, which easily weighed several tons, Anderson squatted down and attempted to dig down to find some bottom to the boulder, which was easily 15 feet tall. Finding that it in fact went considerably deeper into the earth than he could see, he first began trying to dig it out, but after a few minutes realized such was a waste of time. So, winding back, Anderson plunged his hands into the rock face itself, hoping he would manage to create some grips or at the very least holes with which he could try to lift it. But, much to his surprise, his punches failed to create the crevices or holes he had planned on, and instead shattered the large hunk of stone into several large broken pieces. Still of substantial size, he first lifted one of the broken boulder fragments above his head. Removing one hand once he felt the balance correctly, he held it then aloft single-handed. Attempting then to toss it in the air as one might a baseball, Anderson misjudged the balance and failed to catch it, sending it falling to the forest floor with a heavy thump he felt throughout his entire body. Trying again, he this time picked the large stone up and, being careful to keep it balanced in his hand, threw the boulder up and out into the forest. Easily weighing 2 or more tons, the rock flew through the air, ripping the branches off of trees as it soared and arced into the air, disappearing from view after a few hundred feet. Its landing was signaled by another enormous thump, which ran up Anderson's legs and straight into his chest. So, he said to himself, super strength. Check. What's next? He thought over what he might search for within the as-of-yet undetermined range of superpowers. Considering his own preferred superhero stories, he wondered if he possessed any psychic abilities. Looking to the remaining chunks of boulder, he, in the fashion of a Jedi, closed his eyes and reached out both with his hands and attempted to do so with his mind. Jedi were always lifting rocks. It seemed to be their thing. After a moment of standing still, his hand outstretched, trying to sense some contact with the boulder, he dropped his arm and sighed. The boulder had not moved, and he felt nothing as he reached out to it. Feeling slightly foolish, he remembered that this was not the first time he had tried to move objects with his mind. In point of fact, it was far from the first time anyone had, as a favorite random question to bring up in conversation had always been to ask friends and strangers when the last time they attempted to move objects with the power of their mind was. In his experience, anyone who claimed to never have done so was an outright liar, and anyone claiming to have not tried in over a month likely just overlooked those times in which a TV remote, cigarette lighter, smartphone, or any other object was just out of reach, and they, feeling too comfortable or too lazy to get up, would reach out and attempt to summon it. Everyone tries, and everyone fails, including you, to be sure. I guess that's a no on the Jedi thing, he muttered to himself, then pondering what other powers he ought to search for. It only took a moment before making the connection. Realizing that he was seemingly indestructible, could fly, possessed super strength, that among the most common powers associated, Superman's own heat vision laser eyes were certainly something he would enjoy. But how to find them? As with his attempted telekinesis, Anderson simply stood and tried to force the effect. His eyes bulged and his head began hurting as the blood pressure in his neck and skull increased. His attempt honestly felt more akin to forcing a bowel movement than trying to shoot lasers from his eyes, and after another moment of straining, he stopped, worried that he may soil himself if he tried too hard. Blinking away the tears which were forced out as he stared, and taking a deep breath after letting out the one he had been holding, he sighed again, saddened by the lack of eruptive laser eyes. Yet no sooner had he relaxed, allowing the blood to flow more evenly through his head, than did he feel a curious sensation welling up behind his eyes. Sensing this, he decided that rather than trying to force it, perhaps he simply needed to relax and let it... Ka-chow! That is the closest vocalization of the sound which followed that is possible. And any who might like to best it should first survive hearing the sound and then feel free to send along an MP3 or WAV file and judgment shall be cast. Regardless, just as the sound erupted, he felt an intense warmth throughout his entire skull, and was suddenly off-put as the warmth itself escaped through his eyes in a focused beam that cut straight through not only the boulder fragment he was aiming at, but set the tree behind it alight. Shit, he said to himself. Okay then, so that works. As the flames crept up the tall pine tree, Anderson's next experiment was clear. Drawing in a deep breath, deeper than that he had ever managed to draw, Anderson puckered his lips and exhaled as forcefully as he could. As the air left him, a hurricane-force wind not only blew out the flames, but toppled the tree. Though not frozen, as certain comic books had led him to believe may happen, the sheer force of his breath he chalked up as a win. Flight, strength, laser eyes, and hurricane breath. What else might he be able to do, he pondered. It took some reflecting on comics and comic movies to determine what else he might try. Thinking then on the power of stretching, as made famous by the Fantastic Four and later the Incredibles, he again awkwardly reached out with his arms, attempting to force them outwards. But, as with the telekinesis, his attempt was merely that, awkward and unsuccessful. He wasn't bothered, though. As be that stretching powers could be useful, they were also a bit goofy, at least to his estimation. But what else could there be? Over the following hours, days, and weeks, experimenting in various barren and vacant lands, he found that while he didn't possess all the typical comic book superpowers, he was awash in new abilities. While teleportation was not in his bag of tricks, the combination of flight and super speed more than made up for such. Though he could not burst into or control flames, he discovered in short order that his body was entirely fireproof. His clothes, however, were not, obligating a super-powered shopping trip in which he opted to indulge, snatching an outfit of brand-name clothing he was and remained unable to afford. Rationalizing that he would undoubtedly save the world at least once, a little shoplifting wouldn't hurt anyone. Beyond this, while he could not see through walls, lacking X-ray vision, he could simply fine-tune his optic blast to carve whatever windows or portholes he might need to see behind whatever stood before him. From there, he discovered that breathing itself was entirely optional, managing both to walk along the ocean floor for several hours without issue, and even floating in orbit once more, there noticing that extreme cold bothered him not in the slightest. As a means to test the opposite of this, he flew to a Hawaiian volcano and, making sure to disrobe, and neatly pack his designer clothing safely in a suitcase, dove naked into the fiery mouth and swam with ease through the liquid magma. Not merely unburnt, he found the experience rather pleasant, akin to lounging in a jacuzzi. Soon, after running through and either confirming or ruling out a range of various superpowers, he began to really think about what he would do with all of them. The options felt limitless beyond the obvious. He could, if he wished, become a proper superhero, using his powers to save the innocent, punish the guilty, and even end wars and human atrocities. Alternately, if he wished, he could become a villain, taking what he wanted from the world with no one to stop him. This latter notion didn't sit well with him now, as he by nature was a generally kind and empathetic person. The guilt and regret over his failure to save the crew of the transport that he drowned still lingered in his mind, and he felt no desire to kill, maim, or destroy anything. The third option, he pondered, was simply laying low and using his powers for whatever he desired. If he wanted riches, he could easily take such from any bank, criminal, foreign power, or wealthy individual he wanted. Though this lent itself more to villainy, he reasoned that if he was to go in such a direction, that so long as he maintained an ethical base for his decisions, and didn't take that which could not be replaced from people who had little or nothing, the scales could balance themselves. Beyond this, if he was to redistribute riches from the wickedly wealthy to the innocent and poor, perhaps a Robin Hood-style justification for his absconding with such could tip the scales back towards the virtuous. There was a fourth option. This one was strangest of all. He could, if he wished, take off and explore the universe. The notion was rooted mostly in the curiosity about space he developed over the many years he spent as an ordinary mortal and sci-fi nerd. He shelved this idea for the time being, seeing it as a sort of final option should he need to leave the planet or just get bored with life on Earth. However, the same concept then caused him to ponder the nature of his mortality, or lack thereof. Could he age? Would he grow old, or would his powers preserve him in his prime at the age of 28? Only time, he reasoned, would tell. Weighing his options, he finally settled on becoming a hero. He thought briefly about adopting a superhero identity, so as to remain anonymous as a private individual, but ultimately decided that, as he had little in the way of personal connections that would be put at risk, he may as well embrace his new occupation. Additionally, as a man of slightly more than moderate vanity, the notion of being celebrated for his future acts of heroism was hard to turn down. The question then came as to what he would call himself. What would his superhero identity be? Naturally, something that conveyed strength, authority, and power. Something which would strike fear into his enemies, were naturally he ever to have any. On this question, he was briefly sidetracked, wondering if there were any enemies who could stand against him. Were there supervillains? He'd certainly never seen anyone else have any sort of superpower, so perhaps a mad scientist type? Maybe he could pick a fight with an evil Elon Musk, or at least a more evil Elon Musk. Shrugging and with a shake of his head, he set aside such questions, returning to the original question of just what name the world would cheer as he saved it from something. It was then while looking about his room, the commandeered luxury merchandise strewn all about it, that it occurred to him. A brilliant idea, at least in his mind. As he looked into the mirror, it came to him. There, emblazoned on his chest, on the front of the hooded sweatshirt he wore, read one word: Supreme. He would be supreme. Not Supreme Man or Captain Supreme, just supreme. It's what he was, after all. Perhaps he could even strike a brand deal with the label itself, he thought. As trite an idea as most of the world would see it, all would come to see that it was a label that fit. With his heroic identity settled upon, and at least a rudimentary understanding of the power he wielded, Anderson decided it was time to do the actual hero stuff. Leaping from his apartment window, he rocketed high into the air above his hometown of Boston and surveyed the city from the sky, searching for signs of crime or emergency. The moon shone down in a rich and bright fullness, and against it hovered the silhouette of Earth's greatest hero, ready at a moment's notice to swoop in and save the day. All was silent. The only problem was, despite his super senses, he couldn't see or hear anything of note from his altitude. All was silent, and perhaps the comics and movies weren't quite as accurate in regards to heroing as he might have hoped. It was quite a lovely view, but did little good in helping him at all. However, then he heard it, the sound of sirens. Below him, he watched as the flashing blue lights of a trio of police cars hurtled down the highway. Diving downward, he flew along, following them while still keeping some 200 or so feet of altitude. After exiting the freeway, the three barreled down the dense surface streets of the city. Anderson debated flying above the buildings, but opted to descend and fly the route some 50 feet above the racing police cars. He told himself that it was to keep a closer eye on and not lose them in the city, but in truth, he simply thought it would look cooler. And he was right. It did. Pedestrians along the street froze after a few, whose attention was drawn by the blaring sirens of the police cruisers, looked up and saw the flying man in the bright white hoodie. Pointing, they, in almost a wave, looked up in awe, most frozen in their tracks at the sight of the impossible. Anderson, or rather Supreme, waved down to them as he continued following the speeding cruisers. His first public appearance. The thrill of it all finally began to ramp up. Here he was, flying to something, some emergency, and it already had the little people of the big city had a chance to see their new hero. Supreme smiled broadly as he let the experience sink in. Rounding a corner, staying closer now to the police, he saw it then. Several blocks down, a swarm of flashing blue lights sat surrounding the entrance to a red brick apartment building. Police and SWAT teams held cover behind vehicles, all with guns drawn and aimed at the front door. Picking up airspeed, Supreme flew past the convoy he'd previously been following and came to a landing at the door the authorities kept their aim upon. The officers on site were, like the civilians before, utterly stunned to see the impossible sight of a flying man. Though their weapons remained trained on target, they largely did so, as all in attendance were baffled and practically frozen in place in confusion and disbelief. It took but a moment, though, for the commanding officer to finally speak up through a megaphone.
"Sir, you have entered an active crime scene. Put your hands where we can see them and walk towards the officers,"
the captain barked. Supreme looked to him and smirked.
"Don't worry, Commissioner. I'm here to handle this,"
he said in his best heroic tone. His hero voice would be something he would need to work on.
"Sir, show us your hand and walk towards the officers,"
the captain repeated. Turning towards the door, Supreme failed to see the SWAT team stack move into position behind him, the lead man brandishing a taser pistol and aiming it at his back. A click and a series of snaps followed as the lead officer fired the barbed and wire leads at Supreme. Though they could not penetrate his flesh, the barbed ends did catch and stick in his sweatshirt, clicking furiously as the current was sent through them. Supreme paused, actually quite annoyed. Turning to the officers stacked behind him, he gripped the wires and with a quick pull, yanked the taser from the officer's hand, catching it with his left. Yanking then on the wires, his eyes flared angrily as he heard the sounds of tearing fabric. Bringing the barbs up to his face for a look, he indeed saw a small cluster of fibers torn from his rather expensive designer hoodie. He glared at the offending policeman, who had now drawn his sidearm and aimed it directly at him. "Really?" Supreme said snidely. Pulling the taser wire taut, he gave slack to the end with the gun on it, and in one smooth motion swung it in a large overhead arc, bringing it clattering and smashing down onto the SWAT officer's helmet. plastic shell of the taser shattered like a cheap child's toy, and in the daze of what was likely a serious concussion, the officer fired a single shot to Supreme's chest. The shot was the perfect trigger for the remainder of police, all of whom had their weapons trained on the subject atop the stairs in the midst of an increasingly tense situation. A hail of gunfire erupted, with rounds glancing off Supreme's indestructible body while also tearing his outfit to absolute ribbons. The weapons continued firing until all the officers had either expended their available rounds or just stopped to stare slack-jawed in awe of the still standing and clearly very angry subject. Supreme's clothes were, from his head to his toe, in absolute tatters. He glared at the officers through the bright and blinding spotlight. "Are you done? Are you fucking done? Look at what you did to my threads. You wait here. I will handle whatever this is inside, and then I'm coming back out. Someone is going to pay for these," he shouted, his voice taking on an unnaturally loud volume while he pointed to his shredded sweatshirt and pants. The area went quiet as the normal mortal stood in stunned silence. Supreme turned again to the door and with a single punch sent the heavy metal security door bursting off of its hinges and flying into the main foyer. As he stepped through, another heavy volley of gunfire rang out, his outfit being shredded to pieces even more, the tiny bits of metal bouncing off his skin. Though he was indestructible, and though the rounds caused no actual pain, the annoyance was reminiscent of being swarmed by mosquitoes. Anderson hated mosquitoes. Supreme hated mosquitoes. Advancing toward the open door at the end of the short hall from which the rounds, likely intended for police but finding a very annoyed, very strong bulletproof target were fired, Supreme picked up and casually tossed the destroyed heavy metal door which sat between them. As he moved forward, hurling the discarded security door over his shoulder, the occupants of the apartment at the end quickly shut their door, barricading it with a sofa. This naturally failed to have the effect they desired, as a moment later the door itself shattered into 1,000 splinters, hit with the force of a hurricane as Supreme simply huffed and puffed and blew their trap house door down. Stepping into the room, he was again hit with a hail of gunfire, which, at some errant rounds missed him and made their way out the door and down the hall, caused the police who were now slowly advancing to return fire, causing Supreme to be caught in the middle of a torrent of bullets. None of this was going as he planned, and his level of annoyance and irritation was almost too much for him. With something halfway between a grunt and a sigh, he scanned the room left to right with his laser heat vision, not merely burning but in many cases slicing hands, arms, feet, and heads from whoever his gaze happened to cross over. Within the room had been roughly a dozen heavily armed criminals of some kind. He wasn't entirely certain as to what they were wanted for or why police were raiding them, at least not at first. He also wasn't entirely concerned, or in actuality, remotely concerned. From the dozen who were in there, at least half had already either died or sustained what would be gruesome yet not ultimately fatal injuries. 3 lay dead, their heads either burned from their bodies or their midsection opened up and cooked. Another 4, however, simply howled in agony as their legs, arms, and in one case, hands had been not only severed, but the stumps and wounds themselves cauterized by the intense heat. As the injured survivors screamed, the remaining 5 who avoided the blast all stood still as statues as they attempted to process what they'd just seen. Supreme forgot the irritation of his destroyed clothing and smirked wickedly at them. "You ready to give up, shitheads?" he said, lacking the wit to offer something more heroic. The 5 looked to one another and then back to Supreme in silence. Then, in an instant, 2 of the 5 raised their shotgun and assault rifle and opened fire. Another 2 made a dash for a window along the back wall. The 3rd attempted to make a run around the length of the room in an attempt to reach the front door through which Supreme had entered. When the gunfire erupted, he dove behind the countertop in the kitchen. The 2 remaining gunmen were dispatched first, with Supreme almost dancing in his super speed as he brought a knife and karate chop down onto the shoulder of the shotgunner, tearing a gash through his torso which split his left arm and shoulder from the rest of his body. Blood and viscera sprayed like a fountain from his split yet momentarily standing body, and covered the walls, ceiling, and remaining gunman, who continued for the brief moment in between his partner's death and his own to spray rounds from his rifle. The second man could be considered lucky by comparison, as it was just as he sought to loose yet another round, Supreme in a split second gripped the piping hot barrel of the rifle, pulled it loose from the gunman's hands, and in a single smooth motion swung the rifle up and around, bringing the buttstock crashing into the man's head, disintegrating his skull upon contact, and sending a brain matter smoothie spraying around the room. In the few seconds it took to dispatch those two, Supreme glared at the two struggling to open the window in their desperate hope for escape. They seemed to be struggling with the latch, and for a moment, the murderous brand-name superhero who watched them found the sight funny after a fashion. Sparing terrified glances back at him as they struggled with the window, each moment surpassed the last in respect to the dread panic that dominated the two men's minds. "It's okay," Supreme said through a smirk. "Go ahead there. Just push the knob all the way to the right. There you go," he said, coaching the two on how to get the window open. "Now, pull it back to the left. Click. There you go. Now, just lift it," he instructed. In a mad and what would otherwise be comical dash, the two attempted to squeeze out of the window together, getting slightly stuck in the process. Supreme let out a genuine chuckle. Out in the alley, where the top halves of the escaping criminals hung from the windowsill, the pair were practically relieved to see an entire SWAT team covering the rear.
"Please, help us!"
one screamed as he reached down and out towards the waiting officers.
"You're under arrest," the lead officer said, advancing to grab hold of the suspect's wrist.
Fine, whatever. Just get us away from this psycho,"
the other said. As the officers pulled at the suspect's wrists, attempting to free them from the window, a bright orange-yellow flash illuminated the windows along the building ever so briefly. Both men hanging from their waists at the window suddenly froze and went still, eyes wide in terror and confusion. The smell of charred flesh, a bit like barbecue pork, wafted throughout the alley from the window, and a moment later, the two torsos fell to the hard concrete, legs nowhere to be seen. Upon their fall, a considerable amount of entrails and blood showered the waiting officers, causing at least one to throw up in his own ballistic mask. The lead officer, who lost his grip on the suspect's arm, looked down at the man he was previously attempting to arrest and assist. To his horror, he wasn't dead. At least, not yet. Looking around in bewildered horror, he looked down to his body, seeing it cut just above the waistline. Shaking his hands, he reached downward, hoping to find legs, but instead finding only the still warm, bloodied remains of his abdomen. Charred intestines spilled from below him, and dark red blood painted the concrete black beneath the pale alleyway lamp. Covered in gore as he was, the officer looked up to the window the two men had been attempting to escape from, only to see the smiling visage of this new threat. He wore a bullet-riddled designer hoodie and looked down on his carnage with a look of amusement. Noting the officer, he spoke. "See, I knew I shouldn't have given them the hotter blast. Would have closed up those wounds right away. Sorry about the mess. I'm Supreme, and I'm here to..." His attention was drawn inside again by the shuffling of the final surviving suspect in the apartment. "Oh, hold on a second." As the desperate and sweat-soaked survivor rose from his hiding spot behind the kitchen counter, he glanced briefly at Supreme with a look of abject terror and took off at a full run for the front door. Making it through into the hallway, he felt a sudden rush of hope and adrenaline. As he hurtled toward the front stoop, he began to scream.
Please, help me, help!"
His screaming was cut off quite suddenly. Supreme had watched as he dashed away, and in that brief time, grabbed the glass top of a coffee table, which somehow had survived the preceding madness, and, snapping it in the middle, took one rough square of it, and drawing from his weekends playing disc golf from his life before, hurled the shard toward the fleeing suspect. The shard spun as it flew, and with the raw speed and power it flew with the spinal cord, windpipe, and arteries along the man's neck, from rear to front, put up little resistance as it decapitated him mid-step. The glass shard came to a stop, wedging itself into the wooden doorframe. The body made it another step and a half, due to it not yet knowing it was dead. His head, while remaining alive and conscious for another 5 or so seconds, was confused as the world began spinning top over bottom. The head felt the contact it made with the floor and most of the roll outwards to where it came to a rest, neck down, face out upon the front stoop, staring out into the sea of police floodlights. A moment later, those lights went dark. In an involuntary spasm of muscles, the tongue began forcing itself out of the mouth in what might look like a taunting gesture, had the eyes not been rolling back into the skull as the head sat decapitated on the top stair. The sight was enough to rattle even the most hardened officer on the scene. As the police kept their weapons and attention trained on the door, they held fire as the strange, seemingly invincible man stepped proudly out onto the stoop. Raising his hands, not in surrender, but in victory, he spoke.
We got him. Well, I got him.
I'm Supreme, and I am your new hero, he said with gusto. He had expected applause and acclaim from the officers he had helped, but instead was met with silence. He paused a moment. Listen, I get it. Guy's got superpowers, now he's doing our jobs, what the hell, right? Again, he'd hoped for some kind of warm reception, perhaps a chuckle or two at his half-joke, but instead, only silence persisted. Well, listen. You all did a great job tonight. Okay? And these guys? Supreme lightly kicked at the head, sending it rolling and bouncing down the steps, spattering blood down the stairs. These guys won't be doing whatever it is I guess they were doing. It was only in that moment that he realized he had no clue what the crime had been or what the police response was over. But thinking on it another moment, he realized in short order that he didn't care or need to know. They were clearly bad men, and clearly got what was coming to them. And besides, it's not like any of them had slow, painful deaths. All in all, he was rather humane in his treatment of such scum. He was justice, and justice was served for whatever reasons.
Keep your hands where we can see them,
the captain barked through his megaphone.
Slowly walk down the stairs towards my offices. When you reach the sidewalk, turn around and get down on your knees.
Supreme laughed derisively. Wait, you're serious?
Slowly walk with your hands in the air toward the offices now,
the captain repeated. Supreme shook his head and laughed. And if I don't? Come on, I'm on your side. I just took care of this whole thing. Listen, I get that there'll be an adjustment period to this, but relax. Guys, I'm with you.
Suspect, I will tell you one more time. Keep your hands where we can see them and walk toward the offices at the base of the stairs.
Supreme sighed, realizing that the Commandante, or whatever his rank was just going to keep repeating the same boring phrase. Fine. I'll see you all around. And with those final words, Supreme shot up into the air angrily. His annoyance at not being recognized for his contribution fed a bit into his takeoff, causing a slight shockwave to rock the parked cars and police cruisers back and forth, and for the officers on scene without sure footing, a bit of falling on their asses. As he rose through the air, he thought to himself that perhaps it was just a rocky start, and that his next act of heroism would be defining. Everyone deserves a mulligan, he figured. especially those with superpowers. As he flew along, he noticed the added ventilation given him by the dozens of bullets which had shredded his costume, as he'd begun calling it to himself, and felt a bit conflicted. On the one hand, it offered a lovely breeze in parts that seldom get a chance to feel the wind. On the other, it was a bit chilly, flying at speed with only ribbons for clothing. Looking over to a nearby clock tower, he noticed that it was well past midnight. As such, his outfitters, in this case one of the few remaining malls to survive the rise of Amazon, would serve him fine. Turning and changing course to head for a mall he knew nearby, he thought again about Amazon, wondering if Jeff Bezos might not make a decent supervillain for him. He already had the Lex Luthor thing down and exuded one of the prime villain attributes, a selfish, greed-based disregard for the welfare of others. The irony to this thought, however, was lost on Supreme, as his disregard for human welfare was only for criminals, villains, and anyone else who may have gotten in the way. In no way comparable, he told himself. Landing on the roof of the mall after making a rough estimate as to how close he was to the shop he was after, he at first thought to simply punch his way through the ceiling. Surely it would crumple like a paper bag, but as he raised his fist, a thought occurred to him. Perhaps he shouldn't cause massive damage to buildings and property willy-nilly. That was to be saved for the hopefully inevitable battle against his enemy, were they to smash through building after building in a final conflict. He'd clearly watched too many movies. This was made clear when he decided that he would use his presumed powers of stealth to breach the building. Finding a ventilation grate, he pulled the cover plate off with ease and looked down the shaft. It was pitch black and had a musty, stale odor to it. Supreme had never made a ventilation duct climb, but he'd seen enough in movies to be sure he'd be fine. Fitting himself face first into the metal tunnel, he slid downward along the diagonal path. Supreme had never made a ventilation duct climb, but he'd seen enough movies to be sure he'd be fine. Fitting himself face first into the metal tunnel, he slid downward along the diagonal path until feeling it level out after some 10 or 12 feet. He wished he'd had a lighter on him, like John McClane from Die Hard. Instead, to illuminate the passage, as he hadn't yet discovered proper night vision as a power, he let his laser vision glow in his eyes, affording enough light to see there was still a long section of duct to climb through. As he shuffled awkwardly along his knees and elbows along the vent shaft, he found himself getting bored with the whole ordeal rather quickly. Pausing, he looked about, pretending that he knew approximately where he was in respect to the mall's layout. Though even within the deeper recesses of his mind he knew he had no clue, his prideful mind assumed he must at least be close. Besides, he was growing claustrophobic and bored in the vent shaft. It wasn't nearly as cool as it appeared in the movies, and either those films had bigger ducts, or actors are in fact, he reasoned, very tiny people. Growing bored and uncomfortable, he decided this was as good a place as any to descend, and carefully burning out a panel along the floor duct, pressed it down and listened as it fell an easy 15 or 20 feet to the tiled floor below. He was clearly above some kind of shop. Unfortunately, though, in his random decision as to which panel to cut away, Supreme burned through a pair of support beams that kept the duct suspended. A moment later, the whole assembly came crashing down from the ceiling, Supreme still inside. He was uninjured, naturally. However, after forcing himself out of the broken sheet metal, he looked about and grunted as it became apparent he was not in the designer shop he'd hoped for, but rather the token Asian shop where cheap katanas, nunchucks, incense, Buddhist statuettes, and ornamental waterfalls were sold. It was the kind of place which would open periodically under one name or another, remaining open just long enough for the permitting business license and process to go through, then reopening at a nearby location with a different name, the same merchandise, and a whole new set of permits and licenses they were free to do business under while waiting for final approval.
Once the decisions were made, ownership would already transfer hands, and the process would start all over. Supreme, like most former mall rats who grew up in the 90s, knew this process well enough, and for a moment wondered if the owners of the shop constituted criminals in their own right. This thought, however, was quickly shelved in his mind as his eyes widened with excitement at the sight of some particularly gaudy novelty katana swords. They had onyx handles and sheaths, with shining fake gold plate along the guard and hilt, which was adorned by a bejeweled dragon's head. Sitting in a small glass case just beside the cash register, Supreme wasted no time in putting his elbow through the glass and drawing the twin, practically prop swords from within. He had no idea what he was doing with them, and that would have been clear to any who happened to see as he wildly waved them around in circles, fighting off imaginary ninja enemies all about the shop. In his excitement, he swung the sword which he held in his right hand hard, and in a single strike decapitated a mannequin dressed in anime merchandise. He hadn't intended to do so, as he had no idea the mannequin was even there, but as the head rolled along the aisle, he was reminded of the criminal he'd decapitated earlier, and couldn't help but think to himself, cool. After another moment or two of goofy fake swordplay, Supreme decided he'd add some of this shop's merchandise to his costume. Donning a red ninja costume mask and taking the two ornamental swords with him, Supreme casually walked through the security glass of the front door and got his bearings. He was, to his delight and surprise, actually quite close to the designer shop he'd been hoping to reach. So, with swords in hand and a ridiculous ninja mask upon his face, he effortlessly forced his way into it and made a beeline for the Supreme merchandise. Donning yet another hoodie, with the label emblazoned on the front, he helped himself to several pairs of sweatpants and an extra hoodie or two before noticing the light shining on his face. At the shattered glass door to the shop stood a terrified mall security guard, shining his flashlight at the suspected intruder. "Don't worry," Supreme began. "I'm a superhero." "Sir," guard replied, "I'm afraid I'm going to need you to put the merchandise down and come with me." He was clearly terrified. "You don't understand. This isn't a crime. I'm a superhero. I'm commandeering these items so I can fight crime," Supreme responded, again expecting his superhero persona to be perfectly obvious. "Hold on a second," he said, as he immediately began disrobing, tearing the shreds of cloth from his body and quickly pulling on the new replacement threads. "Sir, I don't care if you're Batman himself. You're trespassing on private property and are clearly stealing. I'm going to need you to come with me," the guard replied, clearly doing his very best to swallow his fear. He was a man of a small stature, with a thin frame and little in the way of muscular definition to speak of. Even had Supreme not been superpowered as he claimed, his otherwise athletic physique still was imposing, and this was not lost on the guard. "What the—" Supreme began, before composing himself. "Okay, let's start again. I'm Supreme. I am a superhero. I'm just commandeering these so I have an outfit to fight crime in. Got it?" The look on the guard's face conveyed he did not get it. Supreme sighed. "I'm going to have to file a report," the guard stammered, hoping it would at least sound vaguely threatening. Supreme's eyes rolled back in his head. He sighed again. "Okay, how about this? You report this." Then with a smirk, Supreme knelt down into the entirely unnecessary but still really cool superhero flying taking off pose. Then, with a sly look from under his brow, he rocketed upward, blasting through the ceiling, roof, and up into the sky. The guard merely looked exhausted and at a loss. At least there were cameras, he figured, as his report alone would undoubtedly lead to him losing his job. Supreme, now dressed in actual clothing, albeit covered in dust and debris from his less than subtle exit, returned to the sky in search of yet another calamity which required his attention. This did not take long, as the familiar wail of fire truck sirens caught his attention. As with the police from the previous one, he followed until finding a several-story apartment building engulfed in flames. He watched from above for a moment as a team of brave firefighters dashed in through the front door and in through the windows where ladders had been raised, all diving straight into open flame. Supreme was impressed with their boldness and bravery in that moment, knew what he had to do. Coming to land just in front of the fire chief, he winked at the busy yet suddenly bewildered man in the heavy yellow coat.
Who the fuck are you? What the fuck are you doing here? Get back!
The chief exclaimed.
Don't worry, Commissioner. I'm Supreme,
he replied, drawing out the pause to an awkward point.
Commissioner? Supreme?
The chief asked, bewildered.
What the fuck are you talking about, asshole?
Supreme smirked and turned toward the building. Drawing in a deep breath, he let his wind go, covering the building in now freezing air, causing the flames to almost immediately diminish and die. Smoke and steam rose from every door and shattered window in the structure. The chief looked at Supreme in disbelief.
What the fuck did you just do?
He asked in demanding tone.
I just brought the temperature down. Froze the fire out with my
superpowers, Supreme preened.
Wait, you froze that building with that weird blowjob you just did?
Supreme was a little put off at his lack of gratitude, but shrugged it off.
I did.
The chief turned frantically to the rest of his men who held hoses which still sprayed up along the building and those ready to enter to save additional residents.
Everyone, get back!
He screamed. Supreme was confused to say the least as to why the chief insisted everyone move away from the now formerly burning building.
I'm sorry, is there a problem?
Supreme asked.
A problem? Get the fuck back!
The chief then barked into the radio.
Gomez! Franklin! Diaz! Does anyone copy? Get out! Get out now before...
As he spoke, the distinct sound of cracking stone began to come from the seeming building.
What is going on?
Supreme asked slowly, half to himself.
You dumb fuck! You never pour cold water on a hot object? If the temperature change is drastic enough, they...
Just as the chief spoke, a heavy creaking and cracking sound was heard as the top half of the tenement building fell in on itself, leading to the whole structure collapsing. A huge plume of smoke, steam, and ash shot out in all directions. Within the building, nightmares became reality for over a dozen people, counting firefighters. As the icy winds ripped through the building, which had nearly burned to its frame, the sudden temperature shock for those already suffering burns seared with unimaginable agony. Skin already cooked and cracked by the whipping flames now broke and flash froze as the gust of freezing air enveloped them. For the firefighters inside, whose protective gear had kept them relatively at a reasonable temperature, the freeze was a slower process, causing the same temperature shock, though at a slower and more agonizing operation as their capillaries all burst. They lucked out after a fashion, however, as it was moments after the freeze fell in that frozen charred framing and ceiling material all collapsed on the team, crushing them beneath freezing cold, fire-hardened support beams that may as well have been made of stone. All but 2 died immediately, with them lasting just long enough to hear the voice of their chief screaming at what they both only knew to be some idiot. As the blood coursed in irregular spurts from their various wounds, and the world began going dark, the pair wondered to themselves who this idiot was, and how he brought the building down on them like that. These thoughts, however, drifted into nothing, as the men died and their minds went forever to sleep. As before, Supreme, unaware of how he could have possibly failed, given that their fire was now out, simply nodded and offered a little salute to the fire chief, who stood gawking at him, dumbfounded and furious. Before the man could say a word, he shot off again up into the sky, off in search of other calamities that could use his help. Truth, as should be obvious by now, is that Supreme was not a great hero. Absent the most basic knowledge of emergency services, he was in essence more of a bull in a china shop than any Superman. Sadly, however, admitting to himself he hadn't done a great job thus far, such was simply due to a lack of practice, meaning unfortunately for the citizens of Boston and the world, these were far from the last incidents. Deciding to take his heroism international, Supreme took to a high altitude and circled until he saw something familiar. Having come to learn where the Middle East is and what it looks like, as most Americans of his age did, seeing such on the news in the perpetual times of war they lived in, he recognized the Arabian Peninsula as it came gradually into the light. Not entirely aware of the actual layout of the countries in the region, as the Earth looked notably different without the national boundaries drawn on its surface, he dropped down lower and lower, looking for any sign of conflict. Perhaps he could stop a massacre, or maybe hunt a terrorist. He had no idea how to hunt terrorists. No idea, outside of a general stereotype, what one even looked like. He knew there were wars going on somewhere in the region, but never one to really follow the news. He was more or less ignorant as to who it was that was fighting. He knew that Jews lived in Israel, which was around there somewhere. They were always either being attacked or at war with someone. Pausing in the sky, he closed his eyes and listened closely for any sounds of battle or combat. Gunfire, explosions, anything that stood out as trouble. After a few moments of relative silence, he heard it. Heavy thumps, like some far-off bombs going off, could be heard to his left. A split second later, he was hurtling through the air towards the sound of the conflict. Sure enough, looking down, he saw it. A series of flashes from rifles, followed by thumps and flashes from larger field guns. There were 2 sides, each exchanging fire with one another in an open plain. Supreme didn't know who either side was, but knew war was bad, and he should put a stop to it. Swooping down after picking a side at random, he descended and came to land just in front of an advancing tank. Hiding along the left side of the vehicle, a row of soldiers with rifles at the ready took cover behind the slow-moving war machine. Supreme could hear some shouting in a language he didn't speak or understand from within before the tank came to a sudden stop some 10 feet from him. A series of what he could tell were curses, regardless of not speaking the language, followed. The soldiers, who hid along the side of the tank, took up defensive positions, weapons trained on the strange, clearly Western man who had landed before them. No one was sure what to make of any of it. Supreme puffed his chest heroically and pointed at the tank. He had hoped to have some moving or epic words to say to express how war was wrong and everyone involved deserved to go home safe. But never one for eloquence or planning. He looked to the tank and the soldiers, extended his hand, palm out, and said, "Hey, you need to stop all of this." Even as the words left his mouth, he felt disappointed with himself. He made a mental note to workshop his heroic banter later. The soldiers themselves, seeing he wasn't an obvious enemy of theirs, at least not in the sense of their ongoing battle, stared in bewilderment, each from their prone positions laid out on their stomachs. They looked to each other before a sergeant scrambled to his feet and, keeping low, moved toward Supreme. "You are American, yes?" he said with a thick accent. "That's right. Home of the free, baby," Supreme replied, his chest puffing a bit further out. The sergeant was unimpressed, and instead attempted to grab Supreme by the shirt collar and pull him out of the line of fire. Supreme was immovable. "Are you a crazy person? You need to take cover now," the sergeant beckoned. Supreme brushed his hand aside easily, quickly inspecting the collar of his shirt to ensure it hadn't sustained any damage. "I don't think so. I'm here to put an end to this. Enough killing and fighting. You need to learn to live in peace, man. All of your guys. You know? You don't understand. It's not us." The sergeant's words were cut short as a 7.62 round caught him just below the lip of his helmet, blasting the left side of his face apart. His head kicked fiercely to the right as the round made fatal contact, and his body crumpled to the ground. Within a split second, the entire area was under heavy fire, with bullets pinging off the tank and whizzing all about. Supreme caught a few in the torso, much to his annoyance, and turned to the remaining soldiers. "Don't worry, I'll handle this," he said, taking immediately off into the air and flying at speed to the source of the gunfire. There he found roughly a dozen men, all armed with rifles, machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades, all taking positions along a shallow ridgeline as they laid fire down on the others. Though the other soldiers were dressed in typical army outfits, with armor and helmets, these fighters were mostly dressed in more civilian clothing, with mishmashes of various military-style gear worn by most of them. He wasn't entirely sure, but these looked like terrorists to him, and terrorists were bad guys. Landing silently behind them, he stood mere inches before one of the fighters who continued to lay down fire in the direction he had just come from. Tapped on the shoulder, Supreme spoke. "Hey, asshole," he said as the man turned. "Knock it off," he shouted, as he gave the man an uppercut which took his head off his shoulders with such speed that a portion of his spinal column seemed to break and come out with it, like the root of a tooth. The body stood standing for a moment, the muscle contractions causing the trigger finger to squeeze, emptying the magazine into the ground and a small tree before the body gave out. Just before it fell, the head and partial spinal column fell back to earth with a thud. His comrades, for the most part, couldn't hear what had happened, as the thunderous bangs of automatic weapons fire deafened them to everything. One turned to see what had happened after a decent measure of blood registered on the back of his neck in a curious warm spray. Turning, he felt the weapon ripped from his hands by a strange man in a bullet-riddled sweatshirt who moved with impossible strength and speed. Yet before what he was seeing could be registered, the barrel of the AK-47 he was carrying was speared into his face, pushing straight through until the muzzle was protruding from the back of his skull. In the few fleeting moments before unconsciousness and death overtook him, he vaguely experienced the feeling of being lifted off his feet by the steel barrel rammed through his head, turned to the right a bit, and just before slipping into the darkness, felt the most violent jostle as Supreme began firing. Holding the man's corpse dangling by the head of his rifle, Supreme pointed the gun in the direction of the other fighters and squeezed the trigger, firing the remaining 20 rounds in the magazine before hearing a click. He had never fired a gun before, let alone one with a dead man mounted to it. But as he dropped the weapon and man impaled upon it, he noted some beginner's luck, as 2 of the remaining men lay groaning, gripping bullet wounds on their sides and torsos. Walking casually up to one as several others opened fire on him, he lifted the struggling and wounded man up by the neck, locking him eye to eye. "How about you go play with your new friends at their house?" he said, before tossing the man in the air with a spin, catching him by the ankle. Then, with a spin like an Olympic hammer thrower, spun the man about and hurled him into the air towards the tank and troop detachment he had just been firing at. Hurtling through the air end over end, the man arced over the battlefield before coming to a land, or rather crash, into the heavy metal tank which was lining up for a shot. Hitting the corner edge just below the turret, his spine shattered like glass, sending waves of indescribable pain coursing through his broken body. He could no longer move his legs, and was barely even aware of where he was. It was a miracle he was alive at all, and to his God he gave thanks. It was then, upon realizing his arms still worked, at least, that his training kicked in. Reaching inside his jacket, he grabbed the detonator switch that was attached to the heavy vest of C4 explosive he wore beneath his outer layer. Waiting a moment to see if any enemies might converge on him, he was darkly delighted as several enemy soldiers crept up around from the other side of the tank to check on what had been dropped on them. Upon seeing him, each raised their rifle, but sadly for them, they were too late. Bringing his thumb down on the detonator button, cursed his enemies as oppressors and occupiers, and the man exploded. The bomb more or less incinerated him and the 3 soldiers who stood over him instantly. The force was so great, the outer armor of the tank tore like newspaper, with the inner wall blowing into the interior in the form of fast-moving shrapnel, which tore the tank crew to ribbons. In addition to blowing a hole in it, the blast was great enough to where the tank actually tipped over onto its side, crushing the last 2 soldiers who remained in cover. One died instantly. The other would die the following day, succumbing to grievous internal trauma just an hour before a recovery team was sent to search for the patrol would find them. Supreme looked at the explosion from across the field in confusion, though his moment of such was interrupted by gunshots to the back of the head. Turning, he saw a remaining 6 men, all with weapons trained on him, all firing, save one. The 6th man, on the end, he could see was in the process of loading an RPG. Narrowing his eyes, and with a dark smirk, Supreme focused his laser vision at the neck of the explosive round, effectively tack-welding it to the launcher. The Rocketeer took aim, not noticing the weld job, and fired. The blast expelled from the rear tube, but the rocket remained attached, spewing heat and exhaust smoke. The man holding it looked at it and then to Supreme in terror. Attempting to ditch the hot weapon in time, he threw it off and dove for cover, yet he and 3 of his comrades were too slow, and as the explosive went off, a shockwave of shrapnel, dust, and heat tore into the men, killing them instantly. Of the remaining 2, one took grievous injury to the legs and lower torso. One of his legs was sheared off, roughly halfway up half, with a charred foot, still in its boot, sitting some few feet away. He shrieked in agony as the still burning hot bits of metal that were buried throughout his body continued to sizzle. His howls, however, were cut short as Supreme, stepping forward towards his terrified final comrade, who stood frozen in fear, crushed the wounded man's head beneath his shoe with the ease of crushing an egg. The howls turned to a short-lived series of gargles before a final wet and labored breath was heard coming from the exposed windpipe. Turning to the sole survivor, he saw before him a very young man of perhaps 15 or 16 years of age. On his face was a look of abject terror. Without a word, he threw down his weapon, tossed the knife, dropped his ammo, and put his hands into the air. He continually repeated several phrases in languages Supreme didn't understand. He was just about to decapitate the boy when a word he did recognize met his ear.
Mercy!
The boy pleaded in between pleas of various other tongues. Mercy? Supreme replied. You speak English? The boy nodded.
Yes, sir, boss. I speak English. Are you American?
I am, Supreme replied proudly.
I love America. I love Starbucks and hamburger and Marvel Cinematic Universe. I love America.
He almost pleaded. Supreme was unconvinced. His expression shifted to one of murderous glee. He hadn't noticed that he was taking a liking to killing.
I love Nike, blue jeans, and baseball, and Supreme,
he said, pointing at the still readable logo on Supreme's hoodie.
Is super flyest and super clutch style, yeah?
Supreme paused. Even though he knew it was merely a desperate plea to be spared, there was something to it that stroked his ego just right. It was the flyest of styles, indeed. What is your name? Supreme asked.
Khalid.
The young man responded. Like DJ Khalid?
Yes, like DJ Khalid. Just like DJ Khalid.
He paused again. Okay then, not DJ Khalid. I have a job for you.
Anything you want.
I want you to go back to your terrorist buddies and let them know Supreme is coming for them. Khalid looked confused.
Like the clothing brand?
No, you stupid shit, Supreme spat. I am Supreme. I'm a hero. And heroes, we fuck up bad guys. He strolled slowly toward Khalid until the two stood right in front of one another. Bad guys like you, he said, poking his finger gently into Khalid's chest. Understand?
Yes, Mr. Supreme. I understand.
The two stood there in silence for a moment, Khalid terrified and confused, Supreme taking a mental victory lap over his intimidating of the young man. After a moment, Khalid spoke up softly.
So, can I go?
He stammered. Sure, get out of here, Supreme said, shrugging. As Khalid ran off, Supreme shouted to him,
And remember to tell your friends!
Standing there along the now silent ridge overlooking the now silent battlefield, upon which only the smoking and fiery remains of a tank offered any motion, Supreme sighed. That could have gone better, he thought. Those poor soldiers, they probably had families. And these terrorists just offed themselves for no reason, at least which none Supreme was aware of. He felt a rage welling up in him. In a split-second decision, he decided he'd do some house cleaning, and as such, he shot up into the sky in search of more terrorists. This took little time, as within a few moments the sounds of gunfire drew his attention. Turning towards it, he felt the heat behind his eyes, ready for what came next. They'd never see it coming. This took little time, as within a few moments the sounds of gunfire drew his attention. Turning towards it, he felt the heat behind his eyes, ready for what came next. They'd never see it coming. In the secret sub-basement of an undisclosed American intelligence facility, a series of military commanders, intelligence chiefs, and other shadowy figures from agencies and organizations which legally didn't exist gathered around a large round table. They spoke in hushed tones to one another as they all awaited the final guest for their meeting. After a few minutes passed, with some in attendance grabbing coffees and others chatting quietly, the enormous LED flat screen which dominated the wall at the head of the table illuminated, with the seal of the President of the United States displayed as a holding screen. A moment later, as all who were there took seats around the table, the image changed to that of none other than the American president. A visible tension resided within him, more so than the ordinary presidential tension that causes a 4-year term to age all who win the job by 10 or more years. He sighed as he looked about.
So, where are we with things?
The president asked.
Well, sir, began a 4-star general, it seems we have some kind of superhuman on our hands. He's already been responsible for several dozen deaths in Boston. New intel reports he's flown off to the Middle East. We're not sure where exactly. Is he a foreign asset? Saudi? Maybe Iranian?
The president inquired, equally concerned as he was confused.
We're not clear on that, sir, Mr. President, but from the reports we've gathered, it seems he's American. We have no idea exactly where he's from just yet, nor what he wants, but we have reports that outline some of what he can do,
the general replied.
Which is? Well, he can fly, as I mentioned. Additionally, it would appear he's bulletproof, fireproof, super strong, super fast, and... Please don't tell me he has laser vision, General,
the president said, placing his forehead in his palm, with his elbow rested on the resolute desk.
No, I'm afraid so, Mr. President. Freezing hurricane-force breath, too. Well, that's perfect. Just perfect. Do we have any sort of contingencies or strategies for dealing with something like this?
The president asked.
Well, sir, not exactly. As we never expected to encounter, well, a superhero. But my agency is already looking into possible origins to see if there's any sort of tech or the like that might help us level the playing field, one of the shadowy, no-name men at the table offered. Likewise, Mr. President, the full force and ingenuity of the United States military is at your disposal, and are looking over various options should the subject turn out to be more clear and present danger to the nation. So, aside from a few of his abilities and the fact that he's presently out of the country, what else do we know?
The president asked, fixing his jacket in an attempt to appear in control of the situation he knew was wildly outside of anything he was prepared for.
Well, we know his name. Well, his superhero moniker, at least. Which is? He calls himself Supreme, Mr. President. Like the clothing brand.
The president's face again met his palm.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
Chapter 2. With friends like these. The Al Hassan family celebrated in their home's courtyard as the vows were read and the couple was married. Ravi and Aisha grew up together and were The sorts of childhood sweethearts that everyone knew would end up together. Their families, the Al-Hassans and the Asawis, had been neighbors for over 3 generations and had always gotten along. When Habib al-Hassan and his wife Amal had a son, at the same time Mohammed and Sabah Isawi welcomed their daughter into the world, the old friends always dreamed of the day when their families would become one. Without any need from their family's influences, Ravi and Aisha grew up as the best of friends. Once, at that age, the two began noticing one another in a different manner, and soon a romance straight from a storybook emerged. They had worried about formally announcing their courtship to their family, not due to the more typical troubles of disapproving parents or dowry negotiations, but rather both knew that such knowledge would unleash endless talk of marriage, babies, names for the babies, the house for sale right in their family's neighborhood, and every other eager soon-to-be in-law enthusiasm one could imagine. When they finally announced such to their collected families and relatives during Eid al-Fitr, a celebration enjoyed at the end of Ramadan, their parents in particular began celebrating it as though it was they who were getting married once Ravi officially asked Muhammad if he may wed his daughter. Eid al-Fitr lasted considerably longer under their roof that year, all the way until the big day came. The joy and excitement of the two families becoming one and each house welcoming a new member was seemingly amplified tenfold once the vows were read. As the wedding party kicked into high gear with music and dancing, several of the men fired celebratory blasts from their rifles into the air, as was the common practice. Given previous problems with rounds falling back from the sky once fired and injuring and in one case killing random people within the city, it had been agreed ahead of time that they would fire blanks, so as to avoid any potential tragedies sullying this beautiful day. The food was aplenty and delicious. Saffron coffee, fresh tea, and a broad assortment of juices and soft drinks were all on offer. The children, now Ravi and Aisha's respective nephews and nieces, ran madly throughout the courtyard after sneaking some soda, got both a sugar rush and a caffeine buzz, giving them that boundless energy level kids get at parties before crashing and sleeping like logs. All in all, 4 generations of the Al-Hassans and 3 generations of Asawis were in attendance. The day could not have been better. Ravi, unbeknownst to his new wife, had just accepted a lucrative position with an import-export company in Canada, a country Aisha routinely dreamed and discussed about moving to. She had never seen snow and was enchanted by the images of northern winters. Their discussions about such had always almost ended in, "If only we could find our way there," in dreamy tones from the new bride. It was this that inspired Ravi to apply for work there. It wasn't difficult to find, as Ravi was a new grad himself with a stellar GPA and a background in exports. As he took her aside to inform her about their honeymoon to Nova Scotia, with plans to lay their upcoming move on her, at just the right moment while they gazed at some scenic vista, Aisha's eyes went wide with excitement at the prospect. It was already November. There was bound to be snow. Though the couple had received numerous beautiful and expensive gifts from their friends and relatives, this excursion to the great frozen north of the Americas was by far her favorite. She kissed her husband all over his face in excitement. "Really? Canada? Can we go skiing? How about going on a gondola? Do you think we'll see a moose? Maybe we could build a snowman," she said, her words flying out at 1,000,000 miles per hour. Yes. We can do all of the winter things. Then we can try a Timmy Hortons. Have you heard of them?" Ravi replied with a broad smile. "No. What is a Timmy Hortons?" "It's Canada's official coffee. Everyone there drinks it. It must be good." "I want to drink a Timmy Hortons while sitting in a hot tub," Aisha said, her gaze drifting upwards dreamily. "Anything you desire, my love. Anything and everything, I promise." Ravi replied, looking at his bride with a beaming pride and adoration. Aisha furrowed her brow a bit as her eyes remained upward.
Ravi, my love, what is that?
She asked, pointing up to the evening sky. Looking up, Ravi needed to first find what she was pointing to, but after a brief moment, saw it. In the sky, there was a small speck of white and red. He couldn't be sure, but it looked like a man flying overhead. "What could that be?" Ravi said, just as he found himself cut off at the end of the sentence by a streak of red-orange light shooting down from the flying man directly into the courtyard his family celebrated in. As the beam came down, it tore mercilessly through men, women, and children alike, setting some on fire and cutting others into pieces as it traced its way up and down along the length and breadth of the courtyard. Screams of pain and terror rang out, drowning out the music which continued to play. The grand table at which the families had sat together during the ceremony burst into flames and collapsed as the beam continued sweeping through the party. Habib al-Hassan, Ravi's father, staggered towards him, his right arm gone, and the stump which remained a blackened and still smoldering mess of blood and char.
Ravi, take your wife and run,
the older man said before the beam from above traced directly over him, cutting him into two pieces with a diagonal angle, separating his head, shoulder, and right stump in one clean line from the rest of him. A look of urgency and terror crossed his face as the light in his eyes went out, and the sheared section of his body slid from the still standing lower torso, collapsing into a smoking and bloody mess. Ravi was frozen at this sight. His father had been a great man, and now he was quite literally cut down by something. His shock was amplified as he lifted his eyes to see the children, his nieces and nephews, burning. Their screams shattered Ravi, who sunk to his knees as his strength gave out.
My love, run!
He shouted to his wife, who stood in equal shock, horror, and disbelief. She looked to her husband, who sat upon his knees, tears streaming from his face.
Not without you,
she shouted in reply, dashing in her flowing wedding dress towards her husband, attempting to hoist him to his feet. As she did, the beam from above shifted from burning her uncles and aunts, who had attempted to take cover beneath the table but only found themselves cooking together. It began tracing its way quite deliberately toward the couple. The two held each other close and looked into each other's eyes, realizing it would be the last time.
I'll find you. I promise. I'll find you again,
Ravi said as tears streaked down his face.
Only if I don't find you first,
Aisha replied, as the beam of red-orange light and heat crossed over their union, setting fire to the very air about them. It moved slow this time, reducing both to ashen statues of people clinging desperately to one another. Pain was thankfully short-lived, as their nerve endings were completely fried out in a matter of seconds. As their flesh burned and peeled, the two tried with every ounce of life they had within themselves to keep their eyes locked and their embrace strong. When the beam had passed, two ashen figures remained, kneeling in an embrace that lasted long enough for the blowing wind in the furnace that was the courtyard blew them into the open air together, where they drifted off together in a singular dark union. The remainder of the wedding party, who were still alive, screamed and writhed upon the floor, howling in the sorts of pain only deep and severe burns can elicit. The horror of the wedding would forever be remembered throughout the land as one of the darkest days in the province's history. Up above, the killer of these families, who were all but wiped out, smiled with sincere satisfaction.
That'll teach you, fucking Al-Qaeda, Supreme said to himself as he finally stopped burning out the compound he'd found.
Though his vision was such that he could have focused on the party below and seen it was not the terrorist training he assumed it was, he opted simply to strike and ignore the outcome, as the gore had caused and seen earlier was, as he said to himself, enough for one day. As he turned and began flying off, an unexpected sight caused him to stop in place and hover. Before him, flickering in the twilight sky, he could see arcing wafts of smoke sailing back and forth between two sides. It was a rocket fight of sorts. First, a handful of exhaust plumes would streak wildly into the sky and then rain down seemingly randomly on targets. Then, following this, one or two extremely fast missiles would be traded in kind. Things blew up all over, and to he, a hero, this wasn't acceptable. Perhaps, he thought, he could stop a war. Flying directly towards the section of sky which seemed to contain the most of the exchanged volleys and locking his attention onto the first of several rockets he saw take flight, he quickly took it out of the sky with a punch. It felt cool, punching a rocket out of the sky. He proceeded then to do the same with the remaining salvo as they flew onward towards their targets. Soon the sky was cleared of the deadly things as they now hurtled in whichever random direction Supreme had punched them. Several merely fell to earth, landing and exploding in the densely populated urban area below. Several small family apartments were blown up upon impact. For those living above or below these specific units, in a moment following the sudden and violent deaths of whomever may have been occupying the apartment that was hit, those above would find their floors collapsing, bringing they and their families down into the fiery and dusty abyss below. For those on the lower floors, they and their loved ones found themselves either crushed or pinned below the two ceilings from above. Most, thankfully, died more or less instantly. However, for the Al-Sharif family, things took a bit longer. They had been watching TV together, the five of them in their main sitting room. The terror began first with the deafening impact and explosion which, though hitting upstairs from them, blew the windows clean out along with their hearing. Blood ran down from their ears as all they could hear was a shrill ringing, which sounded more like it was coming from inside their head than outside. Omar, the father of the three young children, and husband to Miriam, his wife, screamed for his children as soon as the blast hit, though neither he nor any of them could hear anything outside of a faint noise. All in the apartment choked and struggled to see or hear anything, feeling quite a bit like drowning underwater. As Omar blindly reached out, searching for his family, a sudden shaking that felt like an earthquake rattled the building. Omar, now more desperate than ever, felt around in the blinding dust, with the muted sounds of screams and crying coming from indeterminable directions. Soon his hand landed upon the shoulder of his wife Miriam, and the two immediately gripped onto one another as they now together began blindly searching for their children. Another shock and trembling coursed throughout the building, almost knocking them off their feet, but together they managed to stay upright, each reaching out with their free hands searching for little Zara, Jamal, and Hadim. Zara fell quickly into her mother's embrace as soon as she found her hand in the swirling dust. Hadim was crawling along the floor on his hands and knees when his own grip found his father's ankle, and soon he too was held in the family embrace. Omar knew, at that moment, their only hope was to find Jamal, and then hopefully manage to make it to the concrete stairwell at the end of the hallway, which hopefully would not have been damaged. He began shouting at the top of his voice for his youngest son, feeling the vibrations of his shouts more in his own head than hearing his actual voice. But he was undeterred. Jamal had been sitting closest to the television, which had been backed against the outer wall of the apartment. Taking Hadim's arm and transferring him into the terrified grip of his mother and releasing Miriam against her protests, he bundled his found family together as he went in search of Jamal, using the arm of the sofa as a reference point and struggling to make his way forward to where his son had been sitting. After a few moments of shouting and reaching out in a do-or-die fashion in search of Jamal, he finally found the familiar feel of his youngest son's tiny Velcro sneaker and pulled the boy to him. Cradling the 3-year-old in his arms, he felt around, ensuring he was intact. As he called his name and shook him repeatedly, it was clear that Jamal was not responsive. Through the choking dust and smoke which surrounded them, a moment of clear air drifted out between Omar and Jamal, and looking down, Omar could see his son was dead. He looked down. The brief few moments, the calm in the air allowed for, to see his young boy staring blankly into space. All the light from his eyes was gone, and from his ears, nose, and tear ducts, blood flowed down his little face. Omar's eyes widened in terror and grief as the sight of his youngest child disappeared behind a returned wall of dust and smoke. Omar didn't know whether to thank God or curse him for the brief glimpse at his boy, but either way, in a torrent of grief and dismay, Omar lifted his head and let out a kind of blood-curdling howl that only a bereaved parent can utter, just before the ceiling above them, compounded by the ceiling above it, came crashing down into his flat, killing he and his wife. The children would die 2 days later after being pinned and buried by a small mountain of concrete and steel rebar. The story was repeated throughout the small, dense city they had lived in, with countless other families and buildings being destroyed. Supreme sighed contentedly as he smacked the final rocket into some random direction, not thinking about all the destruction he was raining down on the people below. As he looked at the sky he had cleared, he looked to see two objects, which almost missed his attention. They were the return missiles fired in retribution for the attack. Were it not for his enhanced senses, he might have missed the medium-sized cruise missile hurtling right in his direction. Dodging in the nick of time, Supreme managed to backhand the missile off into some other random part of the city below, feeling rather cool for having done so. This one was not like the others. Those had been crude, homemade garage projects compared to this, which looked like it came from money during the brief glimpse he had managed to get at the thing. Another missile of the same sort flew past him some few hundred yards off to his right, and he watched as it sought out and landed on its target, causing a fiery explosion some mile or so off. Not aware of where he was, who he was fighting, or why, Supreme's first instinct was to approach the source of the launches. As he flew, he noticed the dense, ramshackle build of the city that he had seen had given way to more uniform concrete structures in an altogether different part of town. In his observations, he had lost track of his destination and soon found himself hovering in the now night sky aimlessly. It was then that he heard from behind him another salvo of rockets being fired off, and as they closed in on his position, suddenly something unexpected happened. A deep whirring sound could be heard from below. As it did, a string of lights flew upward towards Supreme, and upon making impact, he knew he was being shot at again. Though these rounds didn't simply flick off him as easily as the others. Instead, these felt like they were the size of baseballs as they pelted his legs, chest, and face. Unbeknownst to him, Supreme had just come face to face with the Iron Dome, a semi-automated series of high-caliber cannons designed to shoot down incoming rockets. His unawareness of this fact was compounded by his instant reaction of honing in on the source of the fire and incinerating it with his laser vision. As another salvo of rockets from the other side flew through the air, the defenses the people counted on smoldered helplessly. Supreme simply shot back up into the lower atmosphere and took off. He'd had enough of the Middle East. Made no sense and wasn't any fun at all. As he flew westward, planning to simply head home and maybe take a nap, he noticed as the dense city lights of Europe suddenly dropped off into darkness, presenting him with the Atlantic Ocean below him. It was after a casual cruise of 5 minutes or so, a curious series of lights below caught his attention, and diving down he quickly came to recognize the arrayed lights as those of a naval battle group. He had, in his younger years, considered and even briefly dreamed of a life at sea with the Navy, and thanks to the various cable TV programs, had learned quite a lot about naval battle groups. They were made up of several ships, all of which sailed together in a formation, and all of whom shared information instantly between each other, letting their attacking and defensive capabilities be coordinated thanks to computer systems. This small handful of ships was a serious weapon, and one Supreme had always dreamed of exploring. Looking closer, he could see that it was in fact an American battle group from the American Navy. This excited him, thinking perhaps he'd finally be able to introduce himself as the hero he was to dedicated protectors of his home country. Could be like the USO. He'd land on the deck and greet the sailors one by one, thanking them for their service. This, he reasoned, would be a brilliant way to wash the taste of explosives and heavy artillery out of his mouth and mind. Diving lower still to where he was practically flying just above the waves of the ocean, he looked about, finding and deciding upon the obvious lead ship. Shooting towards it, he heard a series of alarms went off on deck. Lights all along the ship suddenly turned on, and the sound of frantic activity throughout could be heard even by those without super hearing. As he approached the bow of the vessel, Supreme flew upwards and brought himself down onto the deck as spotlights shone upon him brightly. Coming down gently upon the deck, his clothing once again a tattered wreck, he held his hands out in a welcoming gesture. As he did, some dozen sailors and marines encircled him, each with rifles trained and ready. They were less than impressed, but clearly still confused.
Hello, Seaman. Hello, Seaman, Supreme said in his best attempt at a hero's voice. I am Supreme. The sailors and marines said nothing as more of their ranks joined them, rifles and pistols trained on the sudden and unexpected guest. Between them, none were altogether certain if this was friend or foe or other. They only knew orders maintained that if an unauthorized individual gained access to the ship, they were to be detained. Yet, given that this man had flown down and that he was out in quite literally the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, there was little that could be taken for granted. Fellas, Supreme said with a broad smile, I'm a superhero. Just killed a bunch of jihadis just now. Relax. I'm on your side. The sailors and marines kept their rifles trained on Supreme, who stood for a brief moment in his superhero pose, hands upon his hips, chest puffed, before feeling awkward and returning to a casual stance. While those on the main deck surrounded Supreme with weapons drawn, a petty officer above pulled out his smartphone and began recording. This, the young enlistedman was certain, would go viral. As Supreme continued trying to explain to the confused seaman that he was a terrorist-killing, crime-solving, firefighting American superhero, the petty officer continued recording. He, like most of his shipmates, had seen countless strange things during their time at sea. However, the sight of a man in tattered civilian clothing flying up and landing on the deck of their ship certainly took the cake. There were these missiles, Supreme bragged, and I just swatted them out of the air like nothing. So, anyone want a selfie? The baffled crew looked to one another, unsure of what to do next. It was then that a commander stepped forward. He was a tall, thin man with square shoulders and a jawline that could cut glass. What are you doing here? He asked. I was flying home to Boston and saw you guys down here and figured I'd pop in and say hi, Supreme answered casually. Pop in and say hi. This is a United States naval vessel, not a fucking social club. The commander clearly anticipated coming up with something more clever than that, but sadly found himself in a lurch by the end of the sentence. Relax, Captain. I'm one of the good guys. It's Commander. And this ship is a restricted area. Only crew are allowed, so I'll ask one more time. Fine. I was just showing up to make an appearance. I'll go. Just know, I probably killed more terrorists yesterday than you will your whole career, dickhead, Supreme said, slightly miffed at the cold response to his arrival. Squaring up in the hopes of looking bigger than the commander on the scene, he sneered at the taller man before stepping back and shooting up into the sky once more. The petty officer with the phone continued recording until Supreme disappeared into the dark of the night sky. Though he was not aware of it, the entirety of the nearly 20-ship group trained its defenses on him as soon as he took off, waiting for the slightest provocation to let loose impotent hell upon the superpowered stranger. It would have annoyed him at worst, but thankfully no shots were fired, as such would have likely resulted in Supreme punching some ships and sinking some in the process. The battle group had no idea how close to an unwinnable fight they had been, and likewise Supreme had no idea that as he flew off, the video taken by the petty officer
had been uploaded to social media and had already begun to take off. Even as Supreme flew across the Atlantic, the light of daybreak nipping at his heels, the video, which was unfortunately shot in portrait mode as opposed to landscape, was making the rounds online. Posts across the social media landscape went up featuring clips, still images, or the video itself whole cloth with titles such as America's Superman, Dawn of Supreme, and Release the Snyder Cut. Supreme became an overnight sensation just as night came to an end in America. Within hours, Supreme memes were abound. Before he had even landed at home, which for Supreme was still a rundown apartment just outside of Boston, he had already been identified by the users' websites such as Reddit and 4chan. Anderson Barrett, 31, of Revere, Massachusetts, also known as Supreme, had become a literal overnight subculture sensation. Collapsing into the old and ratty yet impossibly comfortable recliner that sat in the middle of his living room, rather exhausted from his escapades, Supreme realized he hadn't touched his phone in days. He had missed a dozen or so calls, mostly from friends. A good number of the missed calls were from unknown numbers, which in truth were a mix of reporters from media outlets and new fans from the internet who, like the journalist, found his phone number on, of all things, his LinkedIn account. Scrolling over his social media, he was greeted with a flurry of direct messages from friends and strangers alike, almost all asking, "Are you this superhero?" Along the news feeds, countless articles and snippets of the petty officer's video depicting his visit to the ship were abound. Already, a number of bigger blogs and podcasts had covered the story of Earth's first and only superhero, with some presuming a dedication to truth, justice, and the American way, and others expressing fear over the existence of an omnipotent, indescribable flying superhero. In more specific corners of the internet, he was either condemned as a tool of American colonialization, an empire, or praised as the new defender of Western civilization. He preferred the latter, naturally, as no one wants to be the bad guy, especially when not beginning a career as a hero. Over the course of the next few days, Supreme realized that though he had a name, something of a brand, and a standard hero outfit, which during the course of said days he again replenished with an impromptu visit to another mall and designer clothing shop, yet there was something missing. It occurred to him when the third person in an hour came knocking at his door, hoping to meet the viral sensation in the flesh. The missing element was, of course, a lair. Every hero had a headquarters, he reasoned. Why shouldn't he? Lacking some sprawling estate with a cave beneath it or Arctic fortress of solitude, he realized that his best bet would be to occupy some abandoned and ideally hidden building. Flying north, he shot across the skies of New Hampshire and Vermont, waiting to reach truly deep forests where some candidates might be hidden. He thought for a moment about crossing into Canada, and on a couple of occasions he may have done just that. But as a proud American and an American hero, he thought it might be best to stick to the States. As he flew, considerations of superhero lore and lairs drifted through his mind. Would Superman's Fortress of Solitude, for instance, would it presently be melting like the rest of the Arctic due to climate change? Finding that though he himself was more or less indestructible, yet still able to feel heat and cold to uncomfortable degrees, would Superman's ass freeze any time he took a seat around his icy abode? Also, what about Lois Lane? In his admittedly limited experience with women, he came to find that they often found any room they were in intolerably cold. Did she feign being impressed so as to be polite, all the while waiting for the chance to return to her own heated apartment in Metropolis? As he continued pondering this, a structure within the forest below caught his eye. Without heightened senses such as he enjoyed, it would have been a bit more difficult spotting the building, but not impossible. Nature typically tends to hate straight lines, and spotting such in a sea of trees and nature, such as he flew above, suggested he may have found his new home. Or home away from home, assuming he intended on keeping this apartment. Touching down, he found himself presented with a large, squat concrete building, shrouded by trees. Vines and other fauna had already begun to overtake the structure, which was some 100 yards long and 2 stories. The windows, those which weren't broken at least, were for the most part stained from years of the elements and neglect. Pulling on one of the exterior doors, which itself was partially buried by decades of topsoil growth, Supreme listened as the creaking scream of the old rusted door opening and echoing throughout the grand empty structure inside. Stepping across the threshold, he looked around. It appeared to be some abandoned warehouse of some kind, with tracks for a crane still hanging from the ceiling, albeit without the cranes themselves. Birds fluttered from their perches and up to open or shattered windows upon hearing his entrance. A small family of raccoons likewise scattered, dashing toward whatever doors or entrances they could, looking over their shoulders periodically to ensure they weren't being chased before shimmying out of whatever openings they could find. Absent furniture, electricity, running water, or really anything of use to him, Supreme deemed the location just right once he discovered that somehow his phone had service and 5G internet. He could carry his easy chair and other necessities up on his own easily enough. From there, though, he realized all he needed to do was monitor police frequencies on a police scanner app, or, alternately, simply follow the news and launch off whenever he pleased to put down whatever threat was observed. Furthermore, just as he liberated his outfits, he could easily commandeer a generator for power. This, he thought, could be home. It was while imagining how he could use his new space that his phone vibrated in his pocket. It had been doing so almost non-stop for the past day and a half. But so as to test out the strength of his signal, he pulled his phone out and checked his emails. Opening the newest one at the top of his inbox, he was pleased with how quickly it loaded. Reading the header and then the first paragraph, he felt another swell of heroic pride as he considered the text. Dear Supreme, the email began. My name is Jeremy Spencer, and I represent a movement called the Liberty League. We're a group of like-minded patriots who, like you, believe in defending the American way. I cannot express how excited we all were to learn that the world's first superhero is an American, and that you've taken the fight to America's enemies in the way that you have. The letter continued. My colleagues and I will be hosting a bit of an event this coming weekend in Jacksonville, Florida. We would be honored if you would attend as a speaker and describe your fight against the degenerate elements of society and jihadi terrorists. Real Americans deserve a hero like you, and we believe that you can quite literally help us change the world for the better. Or rather, we can help you. In either event, it would be a supreme pleasure to have the chance to meet with you. It concluded. Please feel free to reply to this message at your leisure. We certainly hope to host you at our gathering. I am personally confident that, at the very least, your presence would be inspiring to our members. Thank you for everything you've done and everything you will do for this great country and the noble West. Sincerely, Jeremy Spencer, President of the Liberty League. Supreme was at once excited by both the praise and invitation. He knew his deeds would garner fans, and perhaps, he thought, if he could inspire others to do their part, it would not only improve the world at large, but also cement his legacy as a world-changing hero. He quite quickly replied, Dear Jeremy, thank you so much for your email. I'm really happy to hear that people appreciate what I do. I think the truth, justice, and the American way are the first and most important things to defend in this day and age. I'd be super happy to speak at your event. If you could send me the GPS coordinates, I can look it up on my phone and actually fly in. That should be pretty cool, right? Let me know. Supreme. At last, he thought. Some genuine recognition. A week passed and soon the weekend arrived. An email showed up in Supreme's inbox an hour after responding, pumping up the event as a great next step in restoring American culture and heritage, as well as taking the fight to her enemies. Supreme hadn't ever thought of his hero activities as doing just that per se, but to read it in text and say it aloud, he couldn't help but feel like it was a perfect description of what he figured he was doing. Flying down the coast at high altitude so as to avoid other air traffic, he periodically glanced down at the GPS on his phone, which he noticed seemed to have some trouble keeping up with him. However, soon the sandy beaches and elongated shape of Florida greeted his eyes, and slowing down so as to allow his phone to catch up, discovered he was a mere 30 miles and several thousand feet from the venue. Following the remaining directions, Supreme came to land in a park known as Springfield Park. He was quite immediately mobbed by excited fans and supporters, most of whom were men, and all of whom were white. Upon his landing, he found himself interrupting the present speaker, who, from the middle of a crowd while speaking through a bullhorn, looked up in stunned silence as America's new and only hero descended. Simply pointing wordlessly, the crowd erupted in applause. The speaker, who was a short, stocky, and bearded man of roughly 30 who wore thick-rimmed glasses, a Punisher thin blue-lined t-shirt, and a red hat. He approached Supreme as he came to land and held out his hand. "Supreme?" he asked, eyes alight and excited. "That's me. Are you Jeremy?" Supreme replied. "That's me, Jeremy Spencer. It's such a pleasure to meet you," Jeremy replied as Supreme shook his hand. "Nice to meet you too, Jeremy. I'm Supreme. Decent turnout you've got here," he mentioned, looking around at the hundreds, bordering on 1,000 of, again, very white people in attendance. "When word got out you'd be here, people couldn't wait to join us. You really... quite the inspiration, sir," Spencer said. No, it's you who are the true inspiration," Supreme said, realizing that people appreciate humility, even if it's manufactured. "You guys who, without powers, decide to stand up to evil. You inspire me," he said, each word soaking in false modesty. "Would you care to say some words to your people?" Spencer asked. Supreme found the way he framed the question a little strange. Why not use fans or supporters? All the same, the chance to address an adoring crowd was ultimately what he had flown down the entire American Eastern Seaboard for, and he was not going to question the opportunity to do so now. "Absolutely," he said, as Spencer proceeded to lead him toward the elevated platform, upon which sat below a monument. Guiding him to the makeshift dais, he offered Supreme his megaphone. "No need," Supreme replied with a slight chuckle. Spencer laughed, slightly embarrassed. "Oh, of course. Duh." Supreme leaned in so as to speak quietly to his host. "So, what should I talk about?" "Whatever you want," Spencer's shout whispered in an equally forced and hushed tone. "Maybe talk about how America was the greatest world leader and will be again." Supreme nodded, not entirely understanding the subtext. "Okay, yeah, that sounds good." Spencer stepped back and eyed the hero before him with a sycophantic gaze. Supreme stepped up to the concrete platform and turned to face his audience. The crowd cheered as he raised his right hand to wave to them. Amplifying his voice, but being sure to avoid doing so to such a degree he might shatter either windows or eardrums, he spoke. Hello, fellow Americans." The crowd cheered. "Fellow patriots." The cheer turned into a deafening roar of enthusiasm. "Fellow patriots, I am Supreme. I am your friendly neighborhood superhero." The cheers rose again, and then after a moment of silence, faded. Supreme looked to Spencer, whose face was lit up like a birthday cake with excitement. He was, as he was rapidly learning, not the greatest improvisational public speaker. Spencer simply nodded and gestured with his hand for him to keep going. "So, just the other day, I flew halfway around the world, and I killed some terrorists," he said, almost unsure as he spoke. The crowd went wild at this. Looking over them, he noticed not only a sea of red baseball caps, but also many wearing red armbands. Each with a field of white within a large capital S was emblazoned. Many in the crowd wore Supreme t-shirts in their classic red, white, and black color scheme. This must have been what the S meant, Supreme reasoned. "How'd it feel?" a voice in the crowd shouted out as he considered his next words. Along his flight down from New England, he'd gone over various vague talking points about freedom and justice and the like. But standing there before the mass of people, all with their eyes and ears keenly hanging on his every word, all bullet points and ideas he had went out the window.
Well, to be honest, it felt pretty great,
Supreme replied, causing the crowd to erupt into another round of deafening applause.
It felt amazing, actually. Every one of them could potentially have meant 1 or 5 or 10 or 20 or 100 innocent people getting to see another day because they wouldn't be blown up or shot or whatever. Yeah, it felt right, and I'll do it again.
Once more, the sea of people burst into a cacophony of cheers and chants. The chants were a bit off-putting to a slight degree, with a chorus of "We Are Real America" washing over him in waves. But remembering that they were patriots, Supreme smiled as his adoring fans continued their barrage of noise and fervor. A simple wave of his hand caused their collective volume to increase before a single finger in the air silenced them in an instant.
You know, let me say, it doesn't take super strength or the ability to fly or laser eyes,
He began, flashing his laser vision just behind his eyes.
to be a hero. You just need to do the hero thing, the hero time, and you all know when those times are. It's when you see it. You know how they used to say, if you see something, say something? Well, I say, if you see something, do something.
The crowd erupted in yet another wall of frenzied noise and chanting. Several within the crowd raised their hands as if they were waving to Supreme, who had, despite being gifted in all the ways he was, had never felt this kind of power before. He smiled as he waved back.
We can all save the world if we just take action,
He continued, preening as he did at the sight of his adoring public.
Are you ready to save the world?
He boomed. The crowd cheered almost in unison that they were.
Are you ready to take action?
He again trumpeted to his frothing fan base. Again, a tsunami of howling human voices was his reply.
Are you ready to do something?
At this, everything changed. The crowd turned inward, individuals turning to those in their immediate vicinity, nodding, shaking hands, and forming groups. Supreme was not expecting this. He had hoped he could keep their attention as it fed his vanity in a way he'd never experienced before. He was now a leader of men and women. Yet as the crowd seemed to break up into smaller groups and disperse along the surrounding sidewalks, leaving their own rally, several odd things began to occur all at once to Supreme. Though Spencer approached him with wild and excited eyes, wishing to say something, Supreme couldn't help but follow the breadcrumbs. Taking flight, he took up a mere 30 feet or so as to survey the site better. Things were clicking. First, it was kind of strange to see what was effectively an all-white crowd that size in Florida. He had been to Florida over the course of his life and usually found it to be a very mixed place, with the few consistent gatherings of white or usually tanned but white-skinned people, or Jews from New York and snowbirds from New Hampshire. Otherwise, most of his time, especially in Jacksonville, was marked by how notably more diverse it was than his home in New England. However, if that wasn't strange enough, he could now see several blocks in seemingly all directions. Police had erected barricades, behind which large numbers of what were clearly protesters penned in behind them. Among their ranks, there was notably more in the way of diversity, clearly more women and people of color. Their ranks were notably less uniform in terms of signs, dress, and chanting. And there were even what looked like ninjas hanging out within their ranks. Supreme had never thought he might get to battle or even see ninjas. But the observations continued. Now looking to the dispersing gatherings of his new fan base, many of whom proceeded to don odd helmets and masks that seemed to have been kept in backpacks and the like, he found himself next putting the pieces together upon looking at the park monument. While it was generally known as Springfield Park, the main monument, which sat at the middle, was Florida's tribute to the women of the Confederacy.
Piecing it together slowly, it dawned on him. Red hats and armbands, chants, Confederate monuments. And what if those guys weren't just waving hello? Those guys were Nazis. He was at a white supremacist rally and had just become a keynote speaker. Oh dear, Supreme thought. This was not good. This was not just not good, this was bad. This was very bad. Looking about, he caught the sight of numerous news cameras in addition to the hundreds if not thousands of phones that could likely be pointed at him right now. While he processed the situation, chaos seemed to break out. As squads of the proud attendees began to disperse into the surrounding city, almost every street of which was jammed with protesters and police and apparently ninjas, some of the police barricades became overrun. Swarms of people either leapt over or merely forced their way through the police lines, and soon open clashes between the two sides commenced. Out of seemingly nowhere, pepper spray, bear mace, and clubs were deployed, and the scene descended into an all-out medieval melee in the broad streets of Jacksonville. Supreme was at a loss. Looking down, he saw Spencer, still standing near the dais, looking up at him as a puppy might to a friendly stranger. He scowled at the man as he descended once again. "What the fuck?" he said tersely, coming to earth just before the still enthralled Spencer. "You've done it! You started it!" Spencer almost stammered excitedly. "Done what?" "You've given us the rallying cry we needed!" Spencer, unthinking, skipped forward and hugged Supreme. "Oh, you have no idea how long we've waited for this." Supreme pushed him back, forcefully though, not enough to knock him down or alternately several blocks away. "Waited for what? What the fuck are you talking about?" "It's time! We're going to save Western civilization from all of its enemies. The commies, the leftists, the liberals, Muslims, Jews, and queers, all of it. You've come to save us," Spencer blurted out, as though in the grips of some esoteric ecstasy. Supreme looked over to the ensuing street clashes. "Who are the ninjas?" "Oh, those are just commie anarchists, anti-fascists, just commie scum." "So, wait. If they're anti-fascists, does that make you fascists?" Supreme was not a man of political science, to be sure, but he was at least aware that, like Nazis, fascists weren't good guys. Granted, ninjas typically weren't good guys really either, but they weren't Nazis. At least, he didn't think they were. Maybe during World War II? He wasn't sure. People are always throwing that word around, but I mean, honestly, they had some good ideas. "You know that Nazis are bad guys, right?" Supreme said, cutting the increasingly small man off as worry began to seep into his mind. "Again, that word. And you know I fight bad guys, right?" Spencer tried to respond, but in those moments, all of the awe and adoration he had in his eyes was replaced by a creeping dread. A sense that perhaps he had made a serious mistake. Supreme did little to assuage this feeling. "Mr. Supreme, sir, But don't you fight jihadis? You kill degenerates, and don't you stand for America?" "I guess, but not a Nazi America. That would suck. You guys suck. You're bad guys. Watch what I do to bad guys," Supreme said, a rage boiling up within him. He was not merely angry at feeling tricked into playing a hero to Nazis, nor at the fact that the media had now filmed him doing so, meaning he was probably now known as a Nazi himself. But essentially, no matter what he did, no one seemed to really get what he was about and stood for. Granted, if one were to have asked him, he wouldn't actually have an answer ready, as he, in truth, had no idea what he was doing or really even why. Like most people of his era, he defined his rather ill-defined opinions on his gut reaction to what he knew or thought he didn't like. One thing he knew he didn't like was Nazis. His great-grandfather had lost a toe and a testicle fighting Nazis, and since first hearing that story from his grandfather as an adolescent, He'd always realized that had those Nazis managed to get the other one, he would have never existed at all. Floating in the air once more, a pale and terrified Spencer stood below watching. Supreme flew to the edge of the park and in a booming voice shouted for all to hear. "Patriots! To me! Now!" The sound was great enough to where it was as equally felt as it was heard, much like a fireworks show at close range. The sound and sense of it seemed to cause the entire world around him to freeze as the melee combat stopped. People either walking by or running from the mayhem stopped in their tracks, and a notable quiet crossed that part of town. Eyeing several pockets of his former audience, Supreme sneered. "Bad," he said curtly, before then unleashing the incinerating power of his eyes, carving paths of death and destruction through both fascist and counter-protester alike. He barely cared. So great was his rage at being fooled, being used, being made practically a mockery of, and most of all, being so misunderstood. Time to put down another incident of needless violence and save the world once more, his furious mind said to itself. Several national news feeds went suddenly dead as the camera crews and news crews found themselves likewise burned to an agonizing crisp as the impartial and petulant rage of Supreme flew down from his gaze, scorching everything it touched. A stampede of terrified people, ranging from ordinary civilians to protest combatants from both sides, began to flood in all available directions away from the floating avatar of death who stood in misguided judgment of them all. Looking back down to Spencer, who looked wide-eyed in an absolute shock as to what had just transpired, Supreme sneered. "Put that in your cig and hail it, fucking Nazi. Go fuck yourself." And with those final eloquent words, Supreme rocketed once more back into the sky, bound for his dilapidated warehouse of relative solitude, to try his very best to think about just what kind of hero he was, and now to let the world know. Below and behind him, the charred and ashen bodies of nearly 400 people littered the streets, with hundreds more crying out in pain as their wounds and in many cases lost limbs seared on their bodies like still-cooking meat. It was yet another day in America, in a long line of such that would go down in infamy. In an undisclosed location deep below America's surface, the cabal of political, corporate, military, and intelligence elite, along with handfuls of others whose positions and identities were not to be spoken of, gathered to again assess the latest threat assessment. The mood was dour, and the atmosphere was heavy with the significance of their subject. Though it may surprise many to learn, the top echelons of government and those who pull the strings have for a long time maintained contingency plans for the emergence of a superpowered individual. Roswell, and at least most of its extraterrestrial conspiracy theories, were themselves mostly smokescreens for this. Except for when they weren't. Well, what in the goddamn hell are we supposed to make of this? Is he making some kind of move now? What does he want? A 5-star Army general growled. Officially, there had been no 5-star generals in the U.S. Army since World War II. However, that was only officially. Seems he was speaking at some right-wing political event. Liberty League, they call themselves. Or, well, called themselves. A tall, thin man dressed in an exquisite black suit sat idly scrolling through the report on his own tablet. American white separatists. They say America needs to be white Christians, what Israel is to Jews. Well, that's the stupidest fucking thing I've ever heard, the general half grunted in reply, his teeth bit down on what had been his third cigar that day. So this Supreme character, some kind of Nazi then? It would seem so, given his speech, but then it doesn't explain why he killed so many of them, the man in black replied. He killed more than just those wackadoodles, chimed a bearded man in a leather jacket, fresh from the CIA headquarters. Took out a number of the anti-fascists, half of the media on the scene, and a good 100 civilians as well. If you ask me, I think he was just pissed off about something.
Pissed off? About what, though? His emails even show that he was invited and was excited to go. Then he showed up, rallied them up, and then... I don't get it. What's his angle? The general asked, his brow furrowed in frustration. He's already demonstrated that he doesn't care about sides in foreign conflicts. He can evade even our best satellite and naval tracking. I mean, hell, he flew right up and landed on the bow of one of my battle groups just to offer selfies. He's playing at something. Until we figure out what, we're in serious shit. A 4-star naval admiral barked, still feeling strangely personally violated, having had his fleet's flagship boarded without permission. Gentlemen, said a voice in the shadows, just beyond the round table. I think maybe we've been looking at this the wrong way. What if he doesn't have an agenda? What if he's not after anything at all? What is that supposed to mean? The general grunted. I mean, what if rather than him having some plan or some ideology, he is, in fact, just an idiot? Whispered the man in black, a look of shock and terror upon his face. An atomic idiot. A weapon of mass destruction with, as our records have shown, a 9th grade education, the voice from the shadows said, putting Supreme's personal bio up on the large screen. Anderson Bennett, 30, of Revere, Massachusetts. Dropped out of high school when he was 16, worked as a dishwasher, then a bartender, then bouncer for a while. He had ambitions on joining the Navy, actually. The projections of the shadowy figure's voice turned clearly to the Admiral. Well, that was a missed opportunity, wasn't it, Frank? Fuck you, Gordon, the Admiral spat. Okay. But so how did he get his goddamn powers then? General asked. Doesn't matter, the shadowy figure, known as Gordon, replied. Point is that he has them. He's using them, and he clearly has no idea what to do with them. So what do you suggest? The man in the black suit inquired. Let's give him a challenge. He thinks of himself as a superhero. Let's give him a villain then. Someone who might challenge him. And who might that be? The bearded CIA officer said sardonically. I think I have just the guy.
Chapter 3. Who Needs Enemies? As if the general atmosphere of a long-forgotten and long-abandoned warehouse in the middle of nowhere, with its leaking roof, time-frosted windows, and various decaying animal carcasses left by an as-of-yet unidentified predator in the forest, wasn't drab or dour enough, Supreme brought it several degrees down further, as he sulked in his armchair. He had decorated it with a number of other items he deemed essential for his survival, including furniture, some entertainment products, a generator, and some other various necessities, and yet there he sat in his one old chair sulking. After everything he had done, or at least fancied that he'd done, to now be made such a fool of and be seen as possibly a Nazi even, felt flatly unfair. For days he stewed in that rank, echoing structure, needing neither to eat nor sleep, and battling with himself regularly, attempting to exercise self-control and not stay glued to his phone. They say any press is good press, but they also say no news is good news. And knowing nothing of how any of that even worked, Supreme had developed a superhero-sized anxiety attack, wondering if he'd ever be able to show his face in public again. Though the headlines from more major news outlets bothered him enough on their own, it was ultimately the memes which got to him the worst. Every conceivable rendition of him with Hitler's mustache, some SS uniform, or any other imaginable fascist iconography had been photoshopped and spread like wildfire throughout the internet. Almost more frustrating, however, was there was next to no talk or discussion about how he'd flame-broiled a good number of them right on the street. What was the point of being a hero if you would only end up seeing yourself become a villain? His frustration mounted and once again boiled over, resulting in Supreme randomly grasping at a large piece of rusting pig iron weighing an easy half-ton and flinging it off towards a far wall. Not intending to do so, his action resulted in the punching of a large hole in the concrete wall, which sent both a large plume of dust shooting out in all directions as it fell, but also a family of birds scattering into the wind, as though they too were abandoning him. He sighed, feeling utterly defeated and without so much as an enemy to defeat him. Without enemies, without even friends, knowing that the few people he used to hang around with would now just see him as that super-powered guy they know, Supreme felt utterly alone. The annoying self-critical voice in the back of his and everyone's head made a point of pointing out that he was seeking a sort of fortress of solitude, and in the purest sense, he'd found it. This only served to annoy him further. Part of him felt like jetting off to some war zone to simply blow off some steam, tearing into whoever looked like they were on the wrong side, but realized that even this would likely just draw more unwanted attention. It wasn't that he didn't want attention, as much as he simply wanted a different kind of attention than that which he was presently enduring. Despite any either long or short-term solutions he could come up with, there felt as though there was nothing that could be done at this point that wouldn't make this situation worse. Supreme returned to his sulking, sinking deeply back into his ancient recliner. Bringing up his phone again, he swiped and doom-scrolled through posts, memes, and articles all denouncing, mocking, or generally expressing public disdain for him. A number of the public blogs he skimmed focused on calling him some variety of dude bro, calling him gaudy and tasteless for his choice of cringe fashion. There seemed no end to the angles and varieties of public attack. As he continued scrolling, telling himself he was an idiot for looking at all, a breaking news alert populated his screen. He nearly put the phone away, expecting some nonsense breaking story about himself. Maybe they'd learned about that time in gym class in 3rd grade when he farted in front of the whole class and never fully lived it down until high school. Or perhaps some ex-girlfriend gave some TMZ-type inside scoop about the size and shape of his manhood. Instead, though, he was surprised and relieved to see the story was not about him at all. In fact, it was indeed actually breaking news worthy of the title. "Second superperson emerges in attack on Brooklyn Bridge," read the text alert. Supreme wasted no time in pulling the story up, cursing slightly as the spotty data service caused the video feed to buffer. As the signal resolved, the video caught up with itself. It was an aerial shot of the Brooklyn Bridge in New York. Smoke billowed from the roadway as traffic sat at a standstill. Police lights lit the bridge up from both ends, as within the center, from which the smoke rose, bright white flashes, followed by orange explosions, could be seen. At the middle of it all, Supreme could just barely make out the shape of a man. A man in a strange outfit, which looked to be made of metal. The reporter on the feed did his best to narrate the situation on the screen. "What we're seeing, this seems to be some kind of armored individual. The police have already opened fire on him, to no effect. Whatever kind of weapons these are they're using, they've already blown up several cars along the bridge. Currently, there is no word on possible injuries or deaths, but the situation down there is extremely tense and very dangerous. This all comes on the heels of questions regarding the superpowered individual known as Supreme and his alleged connection to white supremacists. Supreme shut his phone off once more and raised an eyebrow. Had a villain emerged? Or perhaps another hero? Did Supreme inspire others to follow in his footsteps, or had his public relations nightmare given the impression that he was the villain in need of a hero to confront him? These questions milled about in his head, forcing out the previous senses of failure, defeat, and aggravation. He was simply too curious. So, rising from his seat, he took to the air, jetting out of the hole he had created in his fit of anger and up into the sky, southward bound for the city that never sleeps. It took him little time, under an hour in fact, before he found himself flying above the dense and widespread lights of New York City. Not sure precisely where the bridge was, it was upon catching a few flashes of bright white and then orange light from the corner of his eye that his destination announced itself. Sure enough, from the center of the large suspension bridge, black smoke continued to pour upward and off into the wind. Turning, Supreme flew at incredible speed down to the source of all the commotion. Landing amid the smoke and ash, which nearly blacked out the bridge entirely, Supreme took a deep breath in, wishing he had done so prior to landing as the soot and ash coated his throat most disgustingly. With a short cough, he let out a powerful breath, which cleared the area. Some 50 yards from him, he saw the super stranger, who turned to face him as the smoke blew away. Whoever they were masked and armored, looking almost more like a walking tank than a person. A dark hunter green, the outer shell of the armor shined as though brand new. From head to toe, every inch of their body was covered in the green plating, with the helm being itself a smooth round headpiece with 2 orange slits where the eyes should be. Along the forearms, large double-barreled weapons of some form sat atop the arms, barrels flush with the wrists. Along the bottom of the right forearm, a single tube with a glowing pilot flame suggested a flamethrower attachment, while along the bottom of the right, small rockets could be observed. Upon the back and shoulders, more cannons and rocket pods were mounted. If there was ever a walking avatar for the notion of overkill, it was standing before Supreme. Hey! Dickhead Tin Man! The fuck are you doing? Supreme bellowed. The armored stranger squared his shoulders toward Supreme and began slowly stepping toward him. "Oh, you must be that Nazi guy," he said, his voice clearly modulated by whatever technological nonsense his helm contained. "Fuck you, I'm not a Nazi. Just got tricked, and... I killed a bunch of them. Fuck Nazis," Supreme replied, his face awash in indignity. "Oh well, guess you can't trust everything you hear in the media," the figure said, still approaching. "So what do you call yourself, Chrome Dome?" Supreme said mockingly. "You know, that would make more sense if my helmet was actually chrome, moron." "Moron, huh? How about fuck you then?" Supreme hissed, his eyes glowing. "How about fuck you instead?" the armored figure said, his rockets and gun all taking aim at Supreme, who laughed derisively at the futile gesture. "You know I could crumple you like a beer can, right?" "Then why don't you try it, pussy?" "I fucking will," Supreme blustered back. "Then alright then. Fine. Then do it already." "I will," Supreme shouted, almost childlike in the whole back and forth. "Good," the armored man replied, equally churlish and juvenile in his speech. Yet, for all the bluster, the two simply stood there in silence, each posing and glaring at one another as awkwardly as they felt. Supreme genuinely wanted to thrash, beat, or burn the armored stranger, not even out of a sense of heroic obligation as much as personal insult. However, he hesitated, unsure of how it might play to the world which watched on intently. He could see that the walking tank person had indeed caused some serious damage to a number of still smoldering cars and trucks along the bridge. That much was obvious. However, in a rare moment of self-awareness, Supreme considered that burning wreckage and destruction didn't necessarily mean there was villainy afoot. After all, his own exploits tended to result in much the same, and he was, as he was certain, a hero. "So, are you a bad guy, or?" he asked hesitantly.
What? What kind of question even is that?
The Tin Man replied. "It's a straight fucking forward question," Supreme shouted.
It's a stupid fucking question.
"No, it's not,"
And you're a stupid fucking person.
Supreme snarled. "Do you want me to kill you?"
I'd like to see you try, Nazi boy.
"I'm not a fucking Nazi!" Supreme's eyes flared again, yet still, he didn't move. Again, for some reason, Supreme just couldn't bring himself to outright attack. Still wearing the egg on his face from his more recent errors in judgment, he found himself considerably more hesitant. Some might have called this personal growth, but it was in reality simple, self-interested caution. "Oh, hey, what do they call you?" Supreme asked in a less hostile tone. The Tin Man paused. "Well, they don't really call me anything. This is sort of my first time out." "What do you call yourself?"
I was kind of thinking Mechanoid Man,
he replied, sounding slightly unsure. "Mechanoid Man," Supreme asked before quietly repeating the name to himself as though trying it out. "Mechanoid Man. Mechanoid Man.
Hey, why not just
Mechanoid?" The armored man considered it for a moment and then nodded.
Right. Well, how about the Mechanoid?
He said, a strange giddiness somehow betrayed through the modulated robotic-sounding voice he spoke with.
Oh, yeah. That's good.
So, Supreme paused before he spoke again. "What's your deal?" As with all confrontations, this one was certainly not one-sided. And as Supreme stood sizing up and trying to figure out his opposition as best he could, opposite he, within the thick shell of experimental military power armor, with all of its servos and shielding and weaponry, stood a man who was quite honestly terrified, but who had also spent enough time within the gladiator academy known as Rikers Island to know not to show it. Mark Stillwell, recently paroled under special circumstances, was not remotely ready to effectively pilot his suit, let alone ready for a battle with the world's only superhero. If he hadn't already sweat out every remaining drop of moisture in his body, he'd have likely peed himself considerably more than he did. The designers of the suit clearly foresaw such a likelihood, in that the suit itself immediately absorbed his sweat and piss, processing it into potable water for him to drink to stay hydrated. It tasted like piss and sweat, and though the people who put him in it after letting him out of prison assured him it was potable, he couldn't help but wonder if it wasn't just the same piss and sweat coming back through the straw on the interior of the helmet as some kind of cruel joke. He would, under normal circumstances, find such joke endlessly hilarious, so long as it happened to anyone other than him. Looking at the holodisplay image of his gaudy target, his mind raced over all of the questions he was forbidden to ask as to whether the thing had been tested, and how, if he'd be able to survive even a moment of the laser eyes thing Supreme was known for. Which, he had to admit, was also really cool. However, as cool as it was, he held the same opinion of it in that moment as he did a suit of armor designed to make you drink your own piss. It's great
as long as it's happening to somebody else. However, he had his orders and a deal to live up to. The weird suits who had pulled him from his cell and offered him this chance made a point to highlight that if he refused or failed, his incarceration problems would only deepen and extend. A chance to get out of prison with a clean slate and a fat stack of cash, with which he was tersely instructed was for him to, quote, quietly fuck off and stay fucked off with, was hard to turn down. Especially as the alternative was being moved to a different cell block where he was assured he'd be, quote, passed around like an ashtray. All he had to do was fight Supreme and not die. He didn't even have to win. He couldn't understand what was to be gained from it, but being plunked down onto the Brooklyn Bridge and observing what he could only describe as a staged stunt show of cars exploding, and then meeting the flying guy in person, he reasoned it was a waste of time at the moment to even wonder about it. He had to fight Supreme with all the cameras watching. The only thing was, though, that he didn't want to fight Supreme. Not out of fear of being mercilessly killed like the dozens or hundreds or more he'd already killed with his superhero shtick, of which fear there was plenty of already in his mind, but more in that, for some reason, he sort of suddenly felt like he kinda liked the guy. He didn't really seem to be the pompous, holier-than-thou Ubermensch he had originally anticipated, and instead seemed very much to be just an ordinary dude who happened to be superpowered. As he stood there a moment, contemplating this inner conflict, a voice came over his built-in communication system and laid into him with a vicious cruelty.
Stillwell, goddammit! Why are you not engaging?
The voice demanded to know, its words being made all the more shrill by the crackle and treble of the military radio.
I'll ask you again, Mac. What's your deal?
Supreme repeated, seemingly growing equally confused and irritated over the action.
Stillwell, either you pick a fight right now, or it's off to the pig pen for you, and I certainly hope you can squeal,
the voice threatened. Mark was perpetually confused as to why these secret agent or Illuminati stooge types spoke so rudely to him. He'd never done anything but what he was told. Perhaps they were all going through simultaneous divorces. Or maybe being cranky all the time was a prerequisite for the job. I will, just relax, Mark replied, forgetting that much like when speaking to someone over the phone with Bluetooth earbuds, those around you might get a bit confused. You will what? Supreme asked, an utterly baffled look upon his face. Hold on, not you, just a sec, Mark responded, before returning to his ongoing call. Then who? Supreme replied.
Get started now, or so help me God, I throw you into the darkest, most violent pit I can find and disappear you entirely. We're talking black site, no daylight, regular meetings, the whole 9 yards. Hell, we'll even tack on a 10th yard just to keep it interesting for you, the voice hissed through the speakers. What do you want me to do? Mark asked.
You could just surrender, suggested Supreme.
Repeat after me, ordered the voice.
Okay, said Mark. Really? You just surrender just like that? Asked Supreme in a surprised voice. Mark idly waved his hand in that universal sign that he was on a call.
I've come,
Mark repeated, several shades shy of eagerly.
to put an end to you, Supreme.
Mark hesitated. You've come to... what? Fuck up traffic? Supreme asked, growing more confused and irritated by the moment.
You say it or it's your ass. Literally.
The voice hissed. With a deep sigh of resignation, realizing the rock and hard place scenario before him, Mark relented. I've come
To put an end to you, Supreme. His delivery was less than threatening or enthusiastic. This was not lost on Supreme, who paused and looked quizzically at Mark. His brow furrowed at the dissonance between what was said and how he said it confused him greatly. Okay, but why? He replied.
Because no one man,
The voice began. This time, still in a flat and defeated tone, Mark complied. Because no one man should have such power. You're a menace, he repeated, awaiting the inevitable thrashing he knew would come next, and silently hoping he might at least survive it with most of his limbs and organs intact. His mouth went dry, and without thinking, he took a pull from the piss hose. Though acrid and disgusting, it managed to at least help his dry mouth on the cramps he had been developing due to dehydration. If you say so, Supreme replied. What occurred next happened almost too fast for Mark to even process until it was over. As he stood in place, awaiting the red-hot blast from Supreme's laser vision, he was suddenly jolted and thrown off his feet. The impact felt like taking a gut punch from a Buick, which it in fact was. Well, in actuality it was a Kia, but the experience was really quite the same. His armored body flew backwards as the small compact car which Supreme had thrown pushed him first into the air and then down onto the concrete with a bone-rattling crash. All manner of alarm lights and beeps filled his helmet with instantaneous damage and injury reports, none of which he had even a moment to observe, as the car which had knocked him down in the first place came crashing down to rest upon his upper body. Fortunately for Mark, whether it be an automated defensive move by the suit or his own natural instinctual reaction, his arms had come up in a manner allowing him to almost catch the car as it fell. Almost in that while his hands and arms did bear a great deal of the weight as it came down, the baby blue Kia still managed to smash into his head and chest with a resounding clash and clatter. His head and ears ringing, Mark managed to lift and shift the car off of him enough to where he rolled out from beneath it. He climbed from the ground, first to his knees. Everything in his body hurt. From the feeling in his midsection, he was relatively certain he would be shitting blood in a short amount of time. That is, of course, depending on how much time he had left, given how events had begun to unfold. Was this worth it? He wondered to himself as he looked up to where Supreme stood still, motionless, as though awaiting his reply. In Mark's helmet, however, the crackling of a broken radio chimed in. This time, there were not words to chastise, order, or threaten him, but rather several hisses and buzzing noises. These continued for a moment until the communication system finally gave up and died, much to Mark's temporary relief. At least, if he was to die, it wouldn't be to the crackling narrations of what absolute torture and depravity awaited him. Supreme drew back a fist, clearly intending on issuing a flying falcon punch to finish Mark off, but stopped as Mark rose to his feet. Holding out his hands, signaling for a timeout, he was relieved to see Supreme drop his arm and stand down. Once more, on a typical day, he'd find a flying falcon punch endlessly cool. But once more, only provided it was aimed at someone other than him. After throwing the car, Supreme stood motionless, wondering if his opponent was powerful enough to survive the attack. He had never thrown a car at anyone before. Plenty of other things, but never a car. He was both surprised and, if he was being honest, excited as he watched the now wrecked compact car he had hurled now rising from its resting place. Could he have actually met a real supervillain? Could this be the chance for a challenge he had increasingly been hoping for? Would a victory over a legitimately superpowered bad guy help improve his overall sullied reputation?
As the metal man half rolled, half crawled out from beneath the wrecked car, it was clear that the attack had done some damage. He struggled to rise at first, coming to rest on his knees, slightly doubled over. As he rose to his feet, Supreme felt it. The perfect follow-up. The coolest punch of all time. The Flying Falcon punch. But then, something unexpected happened. Rather than retaliating with missiles or whatever other kinds of weapons he possessed, Mechanoid called for a timeout. He continued to double over, one arm placed on the underside of the flipped and destroyed Kia he had just thrown at him for additional support. Supreme dropped his arm, curious to see what this robo-parlay might be about.
Okay, hold on just a second. Time out. Listen, maybe I was wrong.
Mark bleated. I'd say so, yeah. So you don't want to fight now? Supreme replied slyly.
Not really. You threw a fucking car at me. Why a car?
Oh, what did you expect me to do?
I don't know. Laser eyes? That seems to be your thing.
Mark said between grunts and wheezes. At the suggestion, Supreme's eyes glowed, ready to unleash hell, when Mark put his hands up again, this time in an obvious gesture of surrender. The red glow quickly diminished, and a slight smirk crossed Supreme's face. He lifted his chin so as to literally look down his nose at the pleading opponent. So, what's your name then? Your real name, he said as Mark attempted to right himself again, this time managing to stand up straight in despite of the pain. Mark. Mark. Wait. So you're Mark the Mechanoid? Supreme replied with a derisive chuckle. No. Oh, god damn it. No, that's not. Oh, it is. That's the sauce right there. That's it. Mark the Mechanoid, Supreme said. A combination of pride in his cleverness and joy, a bit of real-life trolling rolling through his mind as the words left his lips.
But what are you then? Archibald Supreme?
Mark retorted, but knew as soon as he'd said it, it wouldn't land. It's Anderson. And Anderson Supreme doesn't sound anywhere as cool as Mark the Mechanoid. Mark sighed. He knew there was no point in fighting it. Once a nickname was given, the toothpaste was out of the tube, the genie was out of the bottle, and Mark the Mechanoid was out of defenses. So, why'd you do all this? Supreme asked, looking about at the still fiery wreckage about him. Mark realized that his bosses in this situation probably had something in mind to answer such a question with, but now, out of context with them, and feeling a bit of a change of heart for more than one pressing reason, he decided to tell the truth. Not the whole truth, mind you, but the truth nonetheless.
It was honestly like this when I got here, he replied.
Really? Supreme asked, more with a sense of confused surprise than distrust. He couldn't say why, but the notion of making a new bro, buddy, homie, or friend who to some extent knew the struggles of superpowers and a world which watches everything could be. Well, so what are you up to? He asked. Want to go find some bad guys to fuck up? Mark still struggled to stand up straight or breathe normally, and as such, held out his hand while waving his head.
No, I think I've had my fill tonight. Those Kias, they look light and small until you get one thrown at you.
Sorry about that, Supreme said casually.
Don't worry about it. All things considered, it was actually pretty cool. Right? It felt cool. I don't know what kind of super strength you get out of that suit, but you should totally try it sometime. If you can.
How about I throw one of you? Mark said sarcastically, the deep bruising of bones cursing him from his right flank. Supreme immediately smirked and then smiled at this joking suggestion. Sure, actually. Won't hurt me, really. And you should totally try it out. What better time? He gestured around them at the fiery wreckage that surrounded them. Than now. His mind filled suddenly with this sense of dread that came with the realization that he was likely going back to prison. He had failed in the strange and excessively cloak and dagger plan that the suits and sunglasses offered to him, and as such any number of their previously vague and increasingly specific and generally invasive threats were now all on the table. His communication system was clearly damaged. With minimal technical expertise with super suits, he could still hear the faint low buzz of the radio unit as it failed to either receive or play what he was certain was a tirade of screams aimed at him, and how certain portions of his anatomy would end up worn as jewelry that only got angrier as he failed to hear or simply act upon orders. Above them still hovered police and news media helicopters and drones, all with lights and cameras focused on the pair who were supposed to be dueling on the bridge. Perhaps his sarcasm had saved him in this. Surely, if they at least saw him hurl a car at Supreme, that might be enough for them. Okay then, do you have a preference in type? He asked. What do you mean? Replied Supreme. Like, do you want me to huck like another Kia or Jet at you, or are trucks and Suburbans okay? Dealer's choice, dude. Whatever you want. As he spoke, Supreme widened his stance and eagerly began shifting his weight left to right and back again, like a baseball player awaiting his chance to catch a pop fly. Mark looked around at the remaining vehicles. As he looked about, he noted interestingly that none of the vehicles were occupied. His helmet scanners also showed that none of them even had been, as they lacked any residual biological material, fingerprints and the like. Once he was done being impressed with how nifty and powerful the heads-up display and sensors were, he remembered feeling as though he was watching a staged stunt and action show when he arrived, and now knew he felt that way because he was. This was all an elaborate and really an expensive setup. A moment later, he spied a minivan sat parked and smoldering to his left. He approached it and sized up the best place to grip it from. Mark had always hated minivans of this sort. The soft pastels, the ugly roundness to the body, and of course the fact that in the police pursuit in which he had finally been arrested, it was one of those very vans that had blocked his path and stymied his escape.
Oh, yeah! Good choice, buddy. Never flung a minivan before.
Supreme boomed with tangible excitement. Mark took note of the drones and news cameras in the sky above before lifting up the cursed people carrier and spinning it like a hammer thrower or dwarf tosser, heaved the vehicle into the air, sending it on a perfect arc straight towards Supreme. As it flew, part of him worried that he might injure or kill the guy he just threw it at. A natural reaction to throwing a vehicle at a person, as one does not typically either throw vehicles nor encounter seemingly indestructible people. However, as it careened towards him and crashed dead into him, the van stopped seemingly dead in the air, crumpled as though it had hit a tree made from obsidian, and then fell to the ground with a bang and a crunch. Supreme had stood his ground, and though he had brought his arms up reflexively to shield himself, he remained unharmed, unmoved, and grinning like a child on their birthday. As he brought his hands down, he looked over to Mark, his eyes gone wide with excitement. His jaw dropped in clear amazement.
Dude, that was fucking awesome! I mean, great throw, but
holy shit, when it's coming at you like that, and it's all like, blah, on my car, and you just take the hit. Man, that was cool. Do it again. He spoke, utterly consumed with enthusiasm. Seeing yet another opportunity to perhaps spare himself from the gulag, Mark suddenly had an idea. Okay, yeah, he shouted in reply. Only this time, make it look like we're really in a serious fight. Like, point, shake your fist at me and say, "It's over, mechanoid." Supreme's grin broadened and he chuckled as he watched Mark this time pick up a quad cab pickup with a Punisher skull bumper sticker. He smiled and pointed at it, mouthing the words, "douchebag." This was in relation to the sticker, not realizing half the world routinely did that in respect to his own costume choices. Okay, so, "It's over, Mark the Mechanoid," he howled, trying not to laugh towards the end. He was slightly surprised when the pickup flew at him with both greater speed and power, almost as though Mark didn't like his new name. On that note, he was half right, as Mark was still intent on putting on a show for the cameras. However, Mark found himself in absolute agreement with Supreme, in that hurling cars and trucks at people is in fact very, very cool, so long as it wasn't he whom the car was flying at. In this, Mark decided he was more of a giver than a taker, just before barely managing to dodge the Honda Civic which came speeding toward him at high velocity. Supreme was elated. "Oh, dude, that was fucking cool. Come on, throw me another one. I never needed to dodge anything, so I never tried," he bellowed with joy. A mere moment later, and a Volvo sedan hurtled toward him, and in a split second of super speed, he sidestepped the car and turned, allowing it to pass him within mere inches. The sensation of doing a real super battle with a real super opponent, even if it was just play with a new friend, was exhilarating to Supreme. A blessed respite from the routine of hearing his name and deeds dragged down in the news and all the endless hate he'd experience online. Mark, likewise, was enjoying it, despite his sustained bumps and bruises and possible internal bleeding. Additionally, with every car thrown or unheard shouted utterance by Supreme that would be caught on camera, he felt another inch of space was granted between him and the life of a communal punching bag and concubiness. For the moment, it felt like everything would be okay. Then Supreme upped the ante. Just after the Volvo had come to rest, Supreme shouted out, "Let's see how this works." And upon doing so, let loose a thin, low-powered beam from his laser eyes, which caught Mark square in the chest, sending him hurtling to the ground. From this, he did not immediately rise. "Holy shit, are you okay?" Supreme said, rushing to Mark's side. Mark was himself intact, with only slightly more pain than before. His large problem was that the blast seemed to have knocked his suit offline. He could hear Supreme calling to him from outside, but it sounded more like having someone speak to you whilst sitting in an oil drum than the crisp external audio from before. A graphic of a bar graph slowly filling up came on screen, alerting Mark that emergency backup systems were coming online, but would take a while. He knew in that moment he was actually in the clear. He had somehow pulled it off. He had engaged in battle with Supreme on cameras for all to see, lost, and now all he needed was to await extraction once Supreme left. He was fine. He was better than fine. And as Supreme continued to shout and grow closer to his prone body, asking if he was okay, his own efforts to convey that he was to his new hero buddy were largely in vain, coming through as little more than muffled shouts and howls. Supreme was at a bit of a loss. He could leave Mark the Mechanoid here for the police or whoever to help, but at the same time, With all the misunderstandings between the world and Supreme thus far, how could he be sure his only other, albeit artificially, superpowered friend would be okay? He couldn't even tell if he was okay in the suit at that moment. He had to make a decision. As a hero, he made one.
Okay, don't worry, buddy. Listen, I'm gonna get you out of here. Gonna bring you someplace safe,
he shouted down into the now darkened and lifeless helmet. From within, Mark heard these words and began to panic.
No! I'm fine, guy. I'm fine. Just leave me be.
But it was to no avail. Mark's words were but muted whimpers from behind the helm, and Supreme had already taken to lifting it from the ground. Mark could feel as he was first held aloft by Supreme as they rapidly rose in altitude, then felt as he was shifted to where Supreme merely gripped his shoulder before taking off at what he could feel was a tremendous speed. Fuck, shit, fuck, Mark said to himself, with a myriad of reasons for concern. Firstly, there was the issue that whoever the mystery men were, the cash and freedom in their pockets with his name on them, would likely have no idea how to find him and give him his reward. Secondly, he realized that without any clue as to where he was going, there was little means of making meaningful plans to return, or, should it work out poorly, escape. Finally, the most depressing of matters dawned on him, as it came to his attention that he had absolutely no idea how to remove his suit. He recalled hearing the sounds of mechanics' pneumatic impact guns being used when he was being armored up. All in all, this day had been a bit of a failure. But he was alive, and maybe, just maybe, had made a new friend. Mark pulled greedily from the drinking tube, tasted ammonia, and simply relaxed for the duration of the flight. After some 20 or so minutes in the air, lights and readouts began slowly coming back to life in his helmet. This was equally encouraging and distressing, as on the point of the latter, while he was getting mobility back, he now could also clearly and with robotically enhanced vision see the world far below his very feet, hurtling by at high speed. Mark had always dreamed of one day going skydiving, but after this experience he felt quite okay living out his days never leaving the ground again. He looked up to Supreme, who flew through the air whilst gripping Mark's armor by the shoulder with one hand. Though he was clearly indestructible, Mark thought it funny that at such speed even his face rippled and blew with the passing wind. His sudden jostling alerted Supreme to the fact that Mark was back, and looking down, he smiled to him and spoke.
Hey, buddy. Glad you joined us, Supreme shouted, his voice just barely audible over the din of the wind and speed.
My suit shut down for a while,
Mark attempted to reply.
What?
Supreme asked, his super hearing clearly no match for the cacophony of high-speed wind.
So, increase volume?
Mark asked, hoping the command might work. It did. However, rather than requesting his speaking volume specifically, the machine opted to simply increase the volume on both sides of his shell, resulting in the poor man, who was practically already suffering from an incredible headache on top of many other injuries, to have his headspace utterly filled with the blast of white noise that accompanied. He shouted several times for volume to be reduced before it finally was. His ears were ringing as though he had just left the front row of a rock concert. After some further tries, following the pain between his ears to subside just a bit, he managed to raise the external outbound volume so as to speak. He began to say again his suit had shut down, but as they flew, Supreme looked down and bellowed to him.
Here we are,
he said. as he brought the two down for a landing outside of what looked to be an old abandoned warehouse of some kind. The windows, those which weren't broken and cracked, were largely stained by time, giving the place an equal parts sad and haunted look. Nature had begun overtaking the place long ago. Yet from the night vision peak he'd managed to grab on the way down, it looked littered with random furniture. Supreme, it seemed, had taken him home. "My suit shut down for a while," Mark yelled, finding his voice still heavily amplified. "Whoa, man, take it down a notch. Well, 3. Anyways, welcome to my secret fortress of solitude," Supreme replied proudly. Mark adjusted his volume to a more reasonable level. "Like his with Superman? But wasn't his like a giant ice fortress or something?" "Yeah, well, would you rather I fly you up to the pole and see how you like the weather?" Supreme said dryly. I get it. It's got potential, if nothing else." "I know, right? Plus, it's just way the fuck out here. And I doubt even the government knows it exists anymore. I figured after your suit went down, sorry about that, by the way, that since the news was already saying that you were responsible for all those blown-up cars, you could use a place to lie low. What better place than another superhero's secret base?" He couldn't fault the logic, even if it was completely and entirely, and in a way ironically, off base. He looked about with his mixed night vision, illuminating the area better than broad daylight even could on his internal display, and noted several large discarded cardboard boxes. Through the large half-open bay door that sat along the wall, he noted a very large TV sat before a very old armchair, with various tables, a DJ station, a motion arcade game, and a large black leather sofa scattered around. "Been doing some shopping?" Mark asked, not judging, but certainly pointedly. Yeah. Well, most of this crap is from my old apartment, but I decided I needed to commandeer some basics for living and shit. So as he began, looking closer at the motion arcade game, Battle Driver 2, was that a thing from your place, or was that one of those basics for living and shit? "Hey, fuck you, man," Supreme shot back, feeling slightly attacked. "Hey man, no judgment on my part. You got some nice shit here." Supreme relaxed a bit. "Yeah, thanks. I like to think it's starting to really come together." "You ever play Battle Driver 2? No. But I don't think that game would hold my weight," Mark replied, slightly morose, as the game did look like a lot of fun. Pleased with himself for not vomiting due to motion sickness while being carried through the air at speed, he felt very confident he could handle and would probably enjoy a motion game. "So, take it off." "That's the thing. I don't know how. It's a long story, but," replied Mark, before being interrupted by Supreme. "Let me help," Supreme offered happily, as he approached Mark. Taking his large metal arm in his hand, he began to pull. Mark began to scream. No.
Chilling tales for dark nights.